Hello, everyone. And a very gentle welcome. Tonight, we're going to pull back the scratchy, wool blanket of history to talk about something both profoundly human and deeply misunderstood, the intimate lives of our medieval ancestors. This was an age of soaring cathedrals and questionable medical advice, a time of epic poetry and deeply personal anxieties. It was an era when the most romantic thing you could say to someone wasn't, "I love you," but "our families have agreed our land holdings are compatible." So, before we venture into the past, take a moment to get comfortable. If you enjoy these late-night journeys we take together, a simple like on the video and a subscription to the channel are always deeply appreciated. And I'm always curious to see our global campfire, so let me know in the comments what part of the world you're tuning in from. Now, turn down the lights. Let the hum of the modern world fade away. Let's travel back to a time when privacy was a myth, and love, in all its messy, complicated glory, had to find a way. Let's begin by dismantling the biggest fantasy of all. The medieval romantic encounter did not happen in a four-poster bed draped with velvet, illuminated by a dozen beeswax candles as a lone troubadour strummed a gentle melody. The reality, for the vast majority of people, was significantly less cinematic and infinitely more crowded. Imagine a single, small room. The floor is packed earth, the roof is thatch, and the air is a rich tapestry of scents, the sharp tang of wood smoke, the earthy perfume of damp straw, and the undeniable funk of the family pig, who is sleeping by the hearth and seems to believe he helps pay the rent. This one room is the kitchen, the living room, the nursery, and the bedroom for an entire family, you, your spouse, your 3 children, your elderly grandmother who snores like a collapsing drawbridge, and a few chickens who have no concept of personal boundaries. Privacy, as we understand it, a locked door, a quiet space, was a luxury as unattainable as a dragon. If a married couple sought a moment of intimacy, it required the strategic planning of a military campaign. Timing was everything. So was acoustics. The ideal conditions involved the children being fast asleep, the grandmother having a quiet night, and the pig not getting startled. Curtains, if they existed at all, were thin pieces of cloth that offered visual cover but did little to muffle sound. Gossip, in a tight-knit village, traveled faster than any disease, and thin wattle-and-daub walls were basically medieval amplifiers. Even for the wealthy, solitude was a rare commodity. A noble lord and his lady might have a private bedchamber, but that didn't mean they were alone. Servants often slept on pallets at the foot of the bed, a kind of human security system and room service all in one. A lady-in-waiting or a loyal valet might be expected to stand in the corner, feigning sudden deafness and an intense interest in the wall tapestry. Their job was to be present but invisible, a living embodiment of the phrase, "If you don't make eye contact, it's not happening." Travel offered no escape. Medieval inns were not chains of charming, private rooms. They were exercises in communal living. You paid for a spot in a bed, not the whole bed. You might find yourself sharing a mattress with a traveling merchant, a weary pilgrim, or a soldier who hadn't taken his boots off in a week. If you were hoping for a romantic night away with your spouse, you'd better hope you both ended up in the same giant bed, and that your half-dozen new roommates were heavy sleepers. For those who chose a life in a monastery or a convent, the rules were even stricter, built around the complete eradication of privacy. The goal was to remove all worldly distractions and temptations. But human nature, as it always does, found the cracks in the stone walls. The history of monastic life is filled with tales of forbidden friendships, whispered confessions, and emotional attachments that tested the very limits of the vows. It's probably no coincidence that so many medieval abbeys were built with unusually high, thick garden walls. In the medieval world, no institution had a more powerful, pervasive, and often contradictory influence on daily life than the church. And when it came to the bedroom, the church had a lot of opinions. Its teachings shaped law, morality, and the private anxieties of millions. According to the prevailing theology, physical intimacy had one, and only one, officially sanctioned purpose: procreation. Its divine job description was to populate the earth and, more specifically, to fill the pews on Sunday. It was not for pleasure. It was not for emotional bonding. It was not a way to de-stress after a bad harvest. It was a duty, a sacred obligation, a means to an end. Everything else was a distraction at best, and a mortal sin at worst. This wasn't just a vague spiritual guideline, it was codified in excruciating detail. Theologians, bishops, and local priests produced countless manuals, known as penitentials, that served as guides for confessors. These books laid out exactly what was and was not permissible between a husband and wife, in case anyone got any creative ideas. Think of it as a divinely inspired instruction manual with a very, very long list of don'ts. The very act itself was to be approached with a grim sense of purpose. A popular 13th century sentiment advised that married couples should perform their duty, without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, a holy trinity of joylessness. Passion was viewed with deep suspicion. To enjoy the act too much was to risk prioritizing the flesh over the spirit. Couples were encouraged to be modest, restrained, and to get it over with as efficiently as possible. The preferred, and in some circles only acceptable, method was what we now call the missionary position. This wasn't just a matter of tradition, it was deeply symbolic. It was seen as the most natural position, reflecting the proper order of God's creation. The man, in the superior position, mirrored God's authority over humanity. Any other arrangement was seen as a subversion of this natural order, a step towards animalistic behavior, and an open invitation to demonic influence. Confession was the primary tool of enforcement. During confession, a priest might ask incredibly specific and, to our modern ears, shockingly invasive questions. Did you engage with your wife on a holy day? Did you feel an unseemly amount of delight? Did you attempt any unnatural postures? A 14th century friar likely knew more about the intimate habits of his parishioners than he knew about their agricultural yields. Of course, enforcement was a patchwork. In a bustling city with a worldly bishop, the rules might be relaxed. In a small, isolated village with a zealous priest, they could be suffocating. And for the vast majority of the peasantry, life was guided by more immediate concerns. They would nod politely during the sermon, and then go home and live their lives, hoping God was more understanding than his earthly representatives. If you think coordinating a date night in the 21st century is difficult, spare a thought for a medieval couple. Planning a romantic evening required a detailed liturgical calendar, a working knowledge of saints' days, and the patience of a hermit. The church didn't just have opinions on how you should be intimate, it had a labyrinthine set of rules about when. This calendar of abstinence was less of a schedule and more of a spiritual minefield, laid out by centuries of popes, councils, and theologians. The idea was to carve out huge swaths of time for piety, prayer, and penance, ensuring the soul remained focused on the hereafter, even when the body had more terrestrial ideas. Let's run through the basics. Sundays were out, naturally. That was the Lord's Day, a time for rest and prayer. Fridays were forbidden, as a day of penance in memory of the crucifixion. Saturdays were often off limits too, in honor of the Virgin Mary. Then came the major liturgical seasons. The 40 days of Lent were a period of intense fasting and abstinence. The 40 days of Advent, leading up to Christmas, were also a no-go zone. Add to this the vigils before major feast days, like Pentecost or Easter. Then there were the dozens of individual saints' days scattered throughout the year. Some confession manuals listed nearly 150 days of the year, and sometimes more, as being spiritually off-limits for marital relations. Imagine a young couple trying to navigate this. How about Tuesday, my love? No, dear, that's the feast of Saint Agnes, the patron saint of virgins. It would be ironic. The theological reasoning was that conception during a holy time could have dire consequences. It was believed a child conceived during Lent might be born sickly, leprous, or even an epileptic, seen as a physical manifestation of the parent's spiritual transgression. As with most things, these rules were felt most acutely by the upper classes. A noble lord and lady had a household chaplain, a personal confessor, and the weight of public expectation on their shoulders. They were expected to set a pious example. For peasants, life was more pragmatic. Their calendar was dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the needs of their livestock. When you're worried about your ox, the coming frost, and whether you have enough firewood to last the winter, the finer points of the Feast of St. Bartholomew tend to take a back seat. But the fear of social, if not divine, punishment was real. In a small village, everyone was a watchdog. If it was known that a couple was a little too cheerful and affectionate during a supposedly penitential season, it could lead to public shaming, a stern lecture from the pulpit delivered with pointed eye contact, or the kind of village gossip that sticks to a family for generations. Romance was a game played against a divine clock, and the clock was often stopped. For most people in medieval Europe, romance as we imagine it, a whirlwind of emotion, shared dreams, and passionate declarations, was the stuff of ballads sung by traveling minstrels. Real-life courtship was far more grounded, often resembling a business negotiation more than a fairy tale. If you were looking for a soulmate, you were probably in the wrong millennium. You were looking for a suitable partner. Marriage was, first and foremost, a contract. It was an economic and social alliance between two families. For the nobility, it was high-stakes diplomacy. Daughters were assets, their marriages used to seal treaties, acquire vast tracts of land, or end multi-generational feuds that had started over a stolen horse or a poorly worded insult. A princess might meet her future husband for the first time on their wedding day, her value calculated in territory and political advantage. Affection was something that might, with luck, develop over time. Or not. As one medieval proverb put it, marry first, and love will follow, which sounds less like a romantic promise and more like a hopeful prediction. Even among the peasantry, practical concerns were paramount. A young man's eligibility was judged not by the poetry he wrote, but by the number of acres he farmed, the quality of his tools, and the health of his ox. A young woman was evaluated on her reputation for hard work, her skill in spinning, baking, and brewing, and her general capacity for not causing trouble at the market. A dowry might consist of a cow, a set of linens, or a few precious silver coins, a tangible contribution to the new household's economic viability. Courtship, when it did occur, was a highly public and supervised affair. A young man and woman were rarely, if ever, left alone. A girl might be chaperoned by her mother, a vigilant aunt, or in some cases, the entire village, all of whom had a vested interest in the proceedings. Think of it as dating, but with a live-in audience. This doesn't mean love was non-existent. It simply means that it usually grew within the established framework of marriage, rather than preceding it. Love wasn't the operating system, it was a rare, post-launch software patch that you couldn't guarantee would ever download. If a husband and wife grew to respect and cherish one another over years of shared labor and hardship, that was considered a beautiful and fortunate bonus, not a prerequisite. Still, human ingenuity finds a way. The unofficial courtship, the secret glances across the church pews, the shared songs during the harvest festival, the lingering conversations at the village well, became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. A stolen flower, a playfully woven piece of straw, a whispered compliment, these were the small rebellions against a system of pragmatism. But you had to be careful. Get caught sharing a kiss behind the hayrick, and you could face a public penance, a hefty fine, and a very, very disappointed father holding a pitchfork. Let's address one of the most enduring, and most laughably false, clichés of the medieval world, the chastity belt. You've seen it in movies, cartoons, and curiosity shops, a terrifying iron contraption of straps and locks, supposedly clamped around a woman's waist by a jealous husband heading off to the Crusades. It's a powerful image of medieval oppression. It's also almost entirely a myth. There is virtually no credible historical evidence that chastity belts were a feature of the Middle Ages. The vast majority of examples we see in museums today are not medieval artifacts. They are products of the Renaissance and, more often, the Victorian era. They were created as satirical objects, bizarre curiosities for collectors, or even as 19th-century anti-masturbation devices. The Victorians, in particular, were obsessed with the idea of the Dark Ages as a time of barbarism and repression, and the chastity belt fit that narrative perfectly. Think about it from a practical standpoint. Medieval hygiene was already a challenge. Now, imagine adding a bulky, rusty, unventilated metal device with a padlock. It would have been a recipe for chafing, infections, and misery. It's absurd. Medieval texts, which are often filled with intimate and mundane details of daily life, are suspiciously silent on the matter. No laws regulated their use. No blacksmiths advertised custom fittings. No wills bequeathed a slightly used chastity belt to a nervous heir. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't a real thing. So where did the idea come from? It seems to have originated as a metaphor in literature. An early 13th century allegorical poem uses the idea of a symbolic belt of chastity to represent a woman's virtue. Over the centuries, a figurative idea was taken literally by later generations who were eager to see the medieval period as brutish and unsophisticated. In reality, a woman's fidelity was enforced by far more effective, if less metallic, means. Shame was a powerful deterrent. Surveillance was constant. A noblewoman was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who were part chaperone, part spy. A peasant girl lived in a village where her every move was noted and discussed. Religion, with its threat of eternal damnation, was a constant presence. And strategic marriages, which bound families together, meant that a woman's infidelity could jeopardize not just her life, but the fortunes and honor of her entire lineage. The real chastity belt was the suffocatingly small, interconnected world in which they lived. Here's a fact that might surprise many modern observers, who tend to view the Middle Ages as a monolith of pious repression. Medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels, in many cases, they licensed, regulated, and taxed them. In numerous urban centers across Europe, prostitution was a legal, controlled, and officially sanctioned business. Town councils would designate specific streets or districts for these establishments, the original red light districts. They would issue licenses to brothel keepers, who were sometimes known by the colorful title, Keepers of the Public Women, a line on a resume that surely raised a few eyebrows. Some cities even had these houses municipally owned, with the profits going directly into the town coffers. It was a sin tax that helped pay for road repairs and public fountains. The rationale behind this seemingly contradictory arrangement was one of pure pragmatism. Civic and even some clerical authorities operated on a necessary evil principle. They believed that providing a controlled outlet for male sexual appetite would reduce the incidence of greater sins, particularly the seduction of honorable women, adultery, and sexual assault. It was a form of social engineering, viewing brothels as a kind of civic plumbing for the soul, designed to channel unruly desires away from the general population. The official stance of the Church, of course, was one of condemnation. But in practice, the relationship was often one of quiet hypocrisy. While bishops thundered against the sin of fornication from the pulpit, many monasteries and cathedrals were major urban landlords, and they were not above collecting rent from the very establishments they publicly denounced. For the women who worked in these houses, life was a mixed bag. It was certainly not a glamorous profession. Some were there due to economic desperation, widows, orphans, or women without family support in a world where a woman's survival often depended on men. Others were coerced or trafficked, especially in busy port cities. Yet, the regulations offered a sliver of protection and structure. Some cities had rules mandating clean linens, basic health inspections, fixed prices, and set hours of operation. There were even rules forbidding brothel keepers from forcing women to work on major holy days. Patrons came from every walk of life, knights and squires, merchants and apprentices, university students, and even, despite their vows, monks and priests. It was an open secret, an accepted part of the urban landscape, a testament to the medieval world's ability to reconcile its highest spiritual ideals with its most earthly realities. Let's set a scene. The embers in the hearth are glowing softly. Your beloved whispers something poetic in your ear. They lean in close, and you are enveloped in a powerful, authentic, and thoroughly medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, our ancestors had a very different set of standards. Staying clean was on their to-do list, but it was somewhere below surviving the winter, avoiding the plague, and mending the fence the neighbor's cow broke again. Bathing did happen, but not with the frequency our modern noses would demand. For a peasant, a full-body wash was an infrequent event, perhaps once a month, or more often if they happened to fall in a river. Soap was a luxury item, either a harsh, homemade lye soap or an expensive import from Spain or the Middle East. It was used sparingly. Public bathhouses existed in many towns and were popular social centers, but they were often viewed with suspicion by moral authorities as dens of vice and were frequently shut down during outbreaks of disease. If you were wealthy, you had better options. A noble lady might enjoy a hot bath in a wooden tub, the water scented with herbs like chamomile or lavender. Afterwards, she would be scrubbed down with fine linen cloths. If you were poor, bath might involve a bucket of cold water, a rough rag, and the hope that your personal aroma wasn't strong enough to overpower the smell of the nearby stable. Complicating matters further was a deep-seated suspicion of water itself, particularly hot water. Based on the ancient medical theory of humors, it was believed that bathing opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to miasmas, or corrupt air, which was thought to carry disease. Some doctors advised against bathing too often, fearing it would weaken the constitution. Now, imagine trying to be romantic under these conditions. Perfumes and fragrant oils existed, but they were for the elite. Deodorant was a fantasy for a distant future. Dental care was rudimentary. You might scrub your teeth with a rough cloth and a bit of salt, or chew on mint or parsley to freshen your breath. A kiss was an act of genuine bravery. Clothing added another layer to this olfactory tapestry. Garments were made of wool, linen, and leather, materials that are not easy to clean and are excellent at trapping body odor and every other scent you encountered during your day, from wood smoke to animal dung to the questionable stew at the local tavern. And yet, against this backdrop, people fell in love, flirted, and created families. Perhaps their senses were simply accustomed to a different world. Or perhaps, when everyone carried the same complex bouquet of odors, love was truly blind, and nose-blind. In medieval Europe, family planning was like trying to herd cats in the dark during a thunderstorm. It was an exercise in hope, folklore, and methods that ranged from the vaguely plausible to the utterly bizarre. People were acutely aware of the connection between intimacy and pregnancy, and many went to great, if often ineffective, lengths to control the outcome. The world of medieval contraception was a curious pharmacy of herbal wisdom, magical ritual, and wishful thinking. There was no single, reliable method. Instead, people relied on a grab bag of local traditions. Herbal concoctions were popular, often involving plants we now know have some hormonal effects, but they were prepared with no standardized dosage and were often mixed with inert ingredients. Some of the more esoteric methods sound like they were cooked up by a failed alchemist. Penitential texts list and condemn various practices, giving us a window into what people were trying. There were amulets, made from things like a weasel's uterus or the bone of a black cat, which were to be worn during intercourse. Some rituals involved burying certain objects under the threshold of the house. One particularly gruesome method advised using the finger of a stillborn child as a charm. There were also attempts at physical and barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be a wild overstatement. Some texts refer to using linen or wool soaked in substances like vinegar or brine as a makeshift cervical cap. There are scattered, vague references to using animal intestines, like a sheep's bladder, as a primitive condom, but these would have been rare, expensive, and almost certainly reused. A more common, though equally ineffective, piece of advice was for a woman to jump backward 7 times or sneeze vigorously immediately after intercourse to expel the semen. It was, if nothing else, a post-coital calisthenics routine. The Church, unsurprisingly, condemned any and all attempts to prevent conception. This was seen as a grave sin, often equated with homicide, as it interfered with God's plan and frustrated the primary purpose of marriage. The phrase, spilling the seed upon the ground, from the biblical story of Onan, was invoked as absolute proof of its sinfulness. Despite the theological prohibitions and the unreliability of the methods, people still tried. For a poor peasant family, another mouth to feed could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation. For an unmarried couple, a pregnancy could mean social ruin. The motivation was powerful, even if the means were not. And when these methods inevitably failed, as they so often did, the result was a hasty wedding, a hidden pregnancy, or a very difficult conversation with the village priest. Despite what the stern sermons and moralizing texts might suggest, not every medieval couple waited patiently for their wedding day to become acquainted. The practice of premarital intimacy, or fornication, as it was officially known in church records, was common enough to keep local courts busy and village gossips well supplied with material. Getting ahead of the marital timeline wasn't exactly embraced, but it was certainly a known quantity. In parishes across Europe, churchwardens and local officials kept moral rolls, which were essentially the village's moral spreadsheet, tracking transgressions like blasphemy, failing to attend Mass, and, of course, illicit liaisons. If a couple was caught in a compromising position, or if a pregnancy became apparent, they could be summoned before the local ecclesiastical court. The punishments varied. Most common was a fine, paid to the church or the local lord. The amount might depend on whether it was a first offense, whether the couple showed contrition, and most importantly, whether they agreed to get married. In many cases, a subsequent marriage would erase or significantly reduce the fine, serving as a kind of retroactive permission slip. In other instances, a public penance was required. This could involve standing in front of the congregation on Sunday, draped in a white sheet, holding a candle, and publicly confessing your sin. Let's not forget the social consequences. In the intimate, claustrophobic world of the medieval village, your reputation was everything. Even if the priest was lenient, your neighbors might not be. The gossip could tarnish a family's standing for years. Interestingly, this gray area gave rise to the practice of handfasting. This was a form of public betrothal, where a couple would declare their intention to marry before witnesses. In many regions, this promise was considered a legally binding contract, and the couple was seen as effectively married in the eyes of the community, if not yet the church. They could begin living together, and intimacy was often accepted within this context. Later, the Church's Council of Trent would clamp down hard on these freelance vows, insisting that a valid marriage required a priest. But for centuries, handfasting was a common loophole, resulting in many babies who were, by the new, stricter definition, technically early arrivals. In the medieval world, virginity was not just a personal state, it was a geopolitical asset, a legal requirement, and a community-wide obsession. Its value, however, depended heavily on your social status. For the peasantry, the expectations were somewhat flexible. A young woman was certainly expected to be a virgin at marriage, at least officially. But if she wasn't, the consequences were often manageable. There would be gossip, perhaps a small fine for fornication, and a hastily arranged wedding to legitimize any potential offspring. It was a local scandal, but rarely a catastrophe. For the nobility, however, it was a different story entirely. A noblewoman's virginity was directly linked to the legitimacy of heirs, the integrity of dynastic alliances, and the honor of her entire family. The bloodline was paramount. A lord needed to be absolutely certain that his wife's firstborn son was his, and not the product of a premarital dalliance. A bride's lack of virginity could void a marriage contract, forcing the return of a dowry and potentially sparking a diplomatic incident or even a war between two powerful families. So, how was this high-stakes virtue verified? In a word, unreliably. Often, it was based on reputation and testimony. Did she behave modestly? Did she avoid the company of stable boys and traveling musicians? Other times, the methods were far more invasive. A group of experienced matrons or midwives might be called upon to conduct a physical examination, looking for the presence of the hymen, a method we now know is completely unreliable, but which was taken as scientific fact at the time. The most public and perhaps most awkward ritual was the displaying of the wedding sheets the morning after the marriage. In many cultures, the blood-stained linen was hung out for public view, a triumphant and very graphic confirmation of the bride's purity and the consummation of the union. If the sheet remained clean, it could lead to public humiliation, lawsuits, annulment, and family feuds that could last for generations. Of course, this created immense pressure, and it's not hard to imagine desperate families resorting to alternative sources, like a chicken, to produce the required evidence. Men, of course, were held to no such standard. A young nobleman's premarital experience was often seen as a sign of virility, or at worst, a youthful indiscretion. His history was considered experience, a woman's was considered depreciation. Virginity was a currency, and it was a currency only women were expected to possess. If you're wondering whether same-sex love and attraction existed in the Middle Ages, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Human nature is not a modern invention. But if you're wondering if it was accepted, celebrated, or even acknowledged as a valid identity, that is where the story becomes one of shadows and whispers. Medieval society was built on a tripod of religion, social hierarchy, and property rights, and all three pillars pointed squarely towards heterosexual, procreative marriage. The Church officially classified same-sex intimacy as a grave sin, often labeling it sodomy or an unnatural act, a category that could also include everything from certain heterosexual positions to usury. It was seen as a violation of God's law and natural order. Punishments varied dramatically across time and place. In some regions, the penalty prescribed by law was death, though this was rarely enforced. More common were penances assigned in confession, fines, or public shaming. As always, social status was a shield. Two peasants caught together might face the full wrath of the local authorities, while two powerful nobles might be quietly ignored, their relationship an open secret that no one dared to address. But while the official record is one of condemnation, the unofficial evidence tells a more complex story. We find it in the gaps, in the coded language of letters and poetry. Monks in all-male monasteries wrote passionate letters to one another in Latin, filled with a longing that often seems to transcend simple brotherly affection. Noblewomen, living in close-knit, same-sex court environments, sometimes formed exclusive, lifelong partnerships, sharing a bed and pledging devotion in terms that sound intensely romantic. The very structure of society created spaces where these bonds could flourish. The knightly brotherhoods, the monastic orders, the all-female Beguine communities, these were environments of profound emotional, and sometimes physical, intimacy. Historians debate the precise nature of these relationships, but it is clear that deep, loving, and central bonds between people of the same sex were a part of the medieval fabric. There was no concept of sexual identity as we understand it today. You didn't come out. You simply lived, carefully and discreetly. You communicated in the white space of poetry, in a shared glance over a prayer book, in a language of inference and plausible deniability. There were no pride parades, but there were intense friendships, devoted companionships, and a human reality that persisted, no matter what the law or the church had to say. In medieval Europe, adultery wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a lit match dropped into the dry straw of the social order. Marriage was a sacrament, yes, but it was also a legal contract, an economic merger, and the bedrock of the inheritance system. To commit adultery was to tamper with the very machinery of society. For women, the consequences were devastatingly severe. An adulterous wife was seen as threatening the entire patrilineal structure. Her sin cast doubt on the legitimacy of her children, potentially diverting property and titles to a child who was not of her husband's blood. The punishments reflected this gravity. She could face public humiliation, like being paraded through the town, sometimes with her head shaved. She would lose all rights to her dowry. She could be divorced and cast out, or confined to a convent for the rest of her life. For noblewomen, the stakes were even higher. Her affair could destabilize political alliances and bring shame upon two powerful houses. In some historical accounts, adulterous noblewomen were quietly imprisoned or even executed. The famous Tour de Nesle affair in 14th-century France saw two of the king's daughters-in-law imprisoned for life for adultery, their lovers brutally tortured and killed. Men, on the other hand, operated under a flagrant double standard. A married man's affair, especially with an unmarried or lower-status woman, was often viewed as a moral failing but not a legal crime. It was a sin he could confess, not an offense that would strip him of his property or titles. The law was primarily concerned with protecting the husband's property rights, which included his wife's fidelity. However, a man who had an affair with another man's wife was in serious trouble. He had violated another man's property. The wronged husband might be entitled to financial compensation, a fine known as a wergild in some Germanic legal codes, or, in some cases, he was legally entitled to take violent revenge. Honor killings, particularly among the nobility, were not unheard of. If a husband caught his wife and her lover in the act, medieval custom in many regions gave him the right to kill them both on the spot without legal penalty. It was a brutal system, designed not to protect hearts, but to protect bloodlines and property. The concept of consent in the medieval world existed, but it was a flickering candle in a hurricane of legal, social, and religious pressures. It was not the clear, affirmative standard we strive for today. Instead, it was tangled up in property law, family duty, and a profound power imbalance. Let's start with marriage. Medieval canon law, the law of the Church, did actually establish that a marriage was only valid if both parties freely consented. In theory, two people simply had to declare their present consent to be married to each other. I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, and, poof, they were married. No priest or witnesses were technically required, a fact that caused endless legal headaches. But here is the vast gulf between theory and practice. For a noble daughter, consent was often a formality performed after the real negotiations between families were complete. Her marriage had been arranged since she was a child. To refuse would be to defy her father, dishonor her family, and scuttle a crucial alliance. She might consent verbally, but under immense duress. Within marriage, the concept of consent became even murkier. Theologians and lawyers spoke of the marital debt, debitum conjugal. This was the idea that each spouse owed the other sexual access, and to refuse without just cause, such as a holy day or illness, was considered a sin. A wife legally had very little right to refuse her husband. Her body, in the eyes of the law, was essentially his property. However, the picture is not entirely bleak. The law did distinguish between consensual sex and forcible assault. Rape was a crime, and medieval court records show that cases were brought forward and sometimes prosecuted. A woman's chances of getting justice were, of course, far greater if she had witnesses, a good reputation, and if her attacker was not a powerful man. We also see the complexities of consent being explored in the literature of the time. The entire genre of courtly love poetry is a dance around this theme. Knights pine for unattainable ladies, who often reject their advances. The stories are full of dramatic pleas, refusals, and misunderstandings. It was a fictional space where the power of a woman's no could be explored, even if, in the real world, that no was so often ignored. If you ever get the feeling the medieval church had a profoundly anxious and complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you are absolutely correct. That anxiety permeated its view of the world, and it was nowhere more intense than in its teachings on marital life. To be clear, the church did not, and could not, outright ban sex within marriage. That would have been a demographic disaster. But it did the next best thing. It surrounded the act with so many warnings, restrictions, and expressions of spiritual disapproval that it ideally became a joyless, perfunctory duty. The church's view of pleasure was that it was a dangerous, intoxicating side effect of a necessary medicine, and it should be minimized at all costs. The highest spiritual state a person could aspire to was celibacy. This was the ideal. The saints were virgins or celibates. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity. Even ordinary married couples were praised if they chose to live, in continence, abstaining from physical intimacy. A couple who gave up sex after they had produced heirs was seen as achieving a higher spiritual plane. The spiritual marriage of England's King Edward the Confessor and his wife Edith, who reportedly never consummated their union, was held up as a model of piety. Influential church fathers like Saint Jerome, writing centuries earlier but still hugely important, were explicit in their condemnation of desire. He famously wrote that, "He who loves his own wife too ardently is an adulterer." The implication was that any passion, even for one's own spouse, was a form of lust that distracted the soul from God. Marital relations were permissible for one reason only: procreation. To engage in them for pleasure or for emotional connection was to miss the point entirely. This attitude trickled down into every parish. Priests, guided by their penitential manuals, were instructed to ask parishioners if they had taken too much delight in their marital duties. You can imagine the awkward silence that followed that question in the confessional. It framed a natural human impulse as something to be suspicious of, something to be monitored and controlled. And yet, for all the theological hand-wringing, people were still people. The vast majority of lay folk, the farmers, the merchants, the artisans, likely nodded along to the sermons and then went home and built lives filled with affection, comfort, and love in all its forms. After a brutal day of plowing a field or a stressful week at the market, a moment of human connection was likely a source of profound comfort, not a cause for spiritual panic. They lived in the real world, not just the world of theological ideals. So, after all of this, the arranged marriages, the public shaming, the beaver testicle-based birth control, the suspicious attitude towards bathing, and the church's endless warnings against having too much fun, you might be left wondering, did anyone in the Middle Ages actually fall in love? The answer, whispered from the pages of old letters, sung in ballads, and carved into the shared experience of millions of ordinary lives, is a resounding yes. Love was a stubborn wildflower, constantly pushing its way up through the cobblestones of doctrine, duty, and dynastic politics. It happened in ways both grand and small. We see it in the peasant couples who courted at village festivals, trading wildflowers and whispered promises while their families looked on. We see it in the nobles who exchanged secret letters and clandestine glances across a crowded banquet hall, their hearts communicating in a code no one else could read. We see it in the monks and nuns whose brotherly or sisterly affection, captured in passionate Latin prose, still burns with an undeniable fire centuries later. The literature of the age is saturated with it. The troubadours of southern France created an entire culture around courtly love, a romantic code that glorified longing, devotion, and the ennobling power of an unattainable lady. The stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, while tragic, spoke to a deep cultural belief in the overwhelming power of love to defy all social conventions. And it happened in real marriages, too. While many were arranged, we have records of couples who defied their families to marry for love, and of widows and widowers who chose to remarry not for property, but for companionship in their later years. The church itself, for all its rules, insisted on that crucial element of verbal consent from both the bride and groom, a small acknowledgement that their will mattered. And once married, countless couples built partnerships of deep and abiding affection. They worked the same land, raised children together, survived plagues and famines side by side, and navigated the endless complexities of medieval life as a team. Surviving letters between husbands and wives, often separated by war or business, are filled with real tenderness, real worry, and real longing. Because in the end, beneath the rules, the risks, and the rituals, the fundamental human need to love and be loved remained. It was a quiet truth, a warm hearth in a cold and difficult world, a promise whispered in the dark, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent. It's not a story about dragons or distant galaxies, but it's just as epic. It's a story about an idea so resilient, so practical, that it was born from a disaster, guided an emperor, survived the fall of Rome, and is now, perhaps, more relevant than ever. This is the story of Stoicism, a philosophy forged not in a classroom, but in the crucible of human chaos. And like all the best stories, it begins with a shipwreck. It all began with a man who had everything, and then, in an instant, had nothing. His name was Zeno of Citium, a man from Cyprus, which in the 4th century BCE was a bustling hub of commerce. Think of him not just as a merchant, but as the ancient equivalent of a shipping magnate, a titan of trade. His ships weren't just carrying goods, they were carrying his status, his future, his entire identity. Their hulls were heavy with a particularly precious commodity, a deep purple dye extracted from sea snails, a substance so rare and expensive it was literally the color of royalty. Zeno's world was one of balanced sheets, trade winds, and the satisfying feeling of a fortune well managed. He was, by all accounts, a man who had won the game. But the Mediterranean Sea, the very source of his wealth, is a notoriously fickle business partner. As one of his fleets sailed near the coast of Piraeus, the port of Athens, a storm of legendary fury descended. This wasn't a minor squall, it was a violent, world-ending tempest. The waves didn't just rock the ships, they tore them apart. The sea, in its cold indifference, didn't just swallow his precious purple dye. It swallowed the man Zeno thought he was. One moment, he was a master of the universe, his name spoken with respect in ports across the known world. The next, he was just another survivor, washed ashore with nothing but the clothes on his back and the salt stinging his eyes. When he finally stumbled into the magnificent city of Athens, he was broke, soaked, and utterly adrift. Yet, in that moment of total ruin, he was ironically on the verge of discovering something far more valuable than anything his ships had ever carried. With no cargo to inspect and no business to attend to, Zeno did what lost people often do, he wandered. He found himself in the agora, the sprawling public square that served as the heart of Athenian life. It was a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds, merchants hawking their wares, politicians debating, artists sculpting. And tucked away in a corner of this vibrant chaos was a small bookshop, a quiet island in a sea of noise. It was here, amidst the scrolls of papyrus, that his life pivoted. He picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a collection of dialogues and memories of the great philosopher Socrates, who had been executed in that very city nearly a century earlier. As Zeno read, he wasn't just seeing words on a page, he was encountering a new kind of wealth. He was captivated by the portrait of a man who possessed an unshakable inner calm, a moral clarity that no storm could touch. Socrates was a man who owned nothing, yet seemed to be in command of everything that truly mattered. Fired by this revelation, Zeno approached the bookseller with a question that would change the course of Western thought. He didn't ask for directions to the nearest bank or a lead on a new business venture. He held up the scroll and asked, "Where can I find a man like this?" The bookseller, in a moment of beautiful serendipity, simply looked up from his counter, pointed out into the bustling agora, and gestured towards a man walking by. This was not a polished academic or a charismatic guru. It was Crates of Thebes, a philosopher of the Cynic school, a man known for being eccentric, cantankerous, and aggressively dedicated to a life of poverty. Crates and his fellow cynics were the philosophical punk rockers of their day. They believed civilization was a corrupting force and that happiness came from living in accordance with nature, which to them meant rejecting wealth, status, and even basic social conventions with a kind of theatrical flair. Crates had once famously thrown his fortune into the sea, declaring it was better for him to destroy the money than for the money to destroy him. This was the man who would become Zeno's first teacher. Imagine the culture shock. Zeno, the former tycoon accustomed to fine linens and respectful subordinates, was now a student of a man who saw possessions as a disease. At first, he struggled. The extreme austerity of cynicism was a world away from the comfortable life he had known. But Crates planted a crucial seed in his mind, the idea that external circumstances have no bearing on your inner worth. Zeno, however, was a synthesizer, not a dogmatist. He didn't stay a cynic forever. Over the next 2 decades, he studied with various teachers, piecing together his own unique worldview. He took the Socratic focus on virtue, blended it with the cynic's discipline and indifference to externals, and fortified it with the logical rigor of earlier thinkers. Eventually, he was ready to teach. But he didn't establish a formal academy behind closed doors. Instead, he began to share his ideas in a public space, a covered colonnade on the north side of the agora called the Stoa, or the painted porch. This porch was a public art gallery of its time, adorned with magnificent murals depicting great Athenian victories and mythological scenes. It was a place where anyone, soldier, politician, merchant, or craftsman, could walk, talk, and listen. And that's where the philosophy got its name, Stoicism, the philosophy of the porch. Think about the significance of that. Stoicism was not born in an ivory tower, whispered among a select few. It was born from personal disaster and shared openly in a public square. From its very first breath, it was a philosophy designed not to help you avoid the wreckage of life, but to help you navigate it with grace and courage. Zeno, the shipwrecked merchant, was its first, and most important, survivor. After the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the strange lessons from crates and the long walks under the Athenian sun, Zeno didn't just teach a few interesting ideas. He began to forge a complete system for living a good life, a good flow, as he called it. At the absolute center of this system was a single, powerful concept, logos. To the Stoics, logos was far more than just logic or reason. It was the divine, rational, organizing principle of the entire universe. Think of it as the universe's operating system, the underlying source code that governs every event, from the orbit of a planet to the falling of a leaf. Everything, they believed, happened for a reason, woven into this grand, cosmic tapestry. The world, as chaotic and messy as it often appears, was fundamentally ordered. And the goal of a human life was simple, yet profound, to align your own personal reason with this cosmic reason. To live in harmony with the logos. From this central idea flowed everything else. Zeno and his followers taught that virtue, or arete in Greek, meaning moral excellence, was the one and only true good. Not fame, not money, not a beautiful home, not even a healthy body. Those things were classified as indifference. Now, this is a term that often gets misunderstood. It doesn't mean the Stoics didn't care if they were healthy or sick, rich or poor. They were human. They preferred health, wealth, and friendship. These were preferred indifference. Sickness, poverty, and isolation were dispreferred indifference. But, and this is the crucial part, none of these things could add or subtract one iota from your moral character. Your virtue was a separate account. What truly mattered was how you used these indifference, how you responded to the hand you were dealt. This is where the Stoic mindset really takes shape. The universe will throw storms at you. People will be unkind. Your body will fail. These are external events, outside the sphere of your control. But your judgments, your intentions, and your responses, those are always unconditionally yours. This was a radical departure from how most people thought then, and how most people think now. We spend our lives chasing comfort, applause, and control over our environment. The Stoics proposed a quieter, more internal path: live in accordance with nature's grand design, accept your fate without resentment, and focus your every effort on one thing only: being a good person, not just feeling good. Their favorite analogy for this was as striking as it was simple: life is like being a dog tied to a moving cart. The cart represents fate, or the logos, moving inexorably forward. The dog has a choice. It can see which way the cart is going and trot along willingly, making the journey smooth and graceful. Or, it can resist, dig in its heels, and fight the rope. In the end, it will be dragged along anyway, but the journey will be one of choking, scraping, and suffering. The cart is going where it's going. Your only choice is how you move with it. Zeno wasn't alone for long. Students flocked to the painted porch, drawn by this powerful message of self-mastery. This porch talk slowly solidified into one of history's most durable philosophies. But a philosophy is only as strong as the people who live it. And in the next generation, the leadership of the school would pass to a man who would give Stoicism its muscle. He was a former boxer, a man who understood endurance not just as a concept, but as a burning in his lungs and a fire in his limbs. His name was Cleanthes. Cleanthes was not your typical scholar. Before he ever set foot in the Stoa Poikile, his life was one of brute force and physical stamina. He was a pugilist, a boxer, who earned his living with his fists in the rough-and-tumble world of ancient athletics. But when he stumbled upon Zeno's teachings, he discovered a different kind of power, a strength that didn't break bones but fortified the soul. He was so poor that to afford his studies, he took a job working through the night as a manual laborer, drawing water for a public gardener. Imagine that, he would spend his nights in grueling physical toil, and his days absorbing the most sophisticated philosophical ideas of his time. His hands were calloused, his body weary, but his mind was becoming a fortress. Cleanthes was the living embodiment of the Stoic ideal that virtue is forged in perseverance, not handed down through privilege. He didn't just talk about enduring hardship, he lived it with every sunrise. He was once mocked in court for his poverty and his menial night job. The judges, suspicious, asked his employer to testify about his work. The gardener confirmed it, and the court was so impressed by his dedication that they offered him a gift of money, which Zeno forbade him to accept. His life was his argument. His most famous surviving work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a magnificent poetic tribute to the Logos. But don't let the name Zeus mislead you. This wasn't simple religious praise. It was a Stoic's declaration of trust in the rational order of the cosmos. "Lead me, O Zeus, and you, O destiny," he wrote, "wherever you have ordained for me to go. I will follow without hesitation. But if I, in my cowardice, am unwilling, I will follow all the same." That is the dog in the cart, rendered as beautiful poetry. For Cleanthes, everything, even pain and suffering, was part of a grand, coherent plan. His stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and profoundly immovable. He also subtly refined the philosophy, introducing a more nuanced understanding of emotion. While Zeno had emphasized a detached, logical calm, Cleanthes suggested that certain emotions, if aligned with reason, were perfectly acceptable. Feelings like joy in the presence of a virtuous friend, or a sense of awe when contemplating the beauty of the stars, these were not irrational passions to be suppressed. They were rational responses to goodness and truth. He wasn't arguing for emotional indulgence, but for a balanced inner life. After all, what is the point of a philosophy if it turns you into an unfeeling automaton? Cleanthes was not a showman. He didn't dazzle crowds with clever rhetorical tricks. In fact, he was famously slow of speech and was even nicknamed the ass by his detractors, though it was said he took it in stride, remarking that only an ass was strong enough to carry the burden of Zeno's teachings. What he lacked in quick wit, he more than made up for in unwavering steadiness. And in the world of Stoicism, steadiness was the ultimate currency. He eventually succeeded Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, not because he was the most brilliant speaker, but because he was its most authentic practitioner. His life was a quiet testament that one could endure poverty without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded in virtue without ever giving up on greatness. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism gained its backbone. And then came the man who would give it a brain. A man who would sharpen Stoicism's ideas into a razor-fine logical system. His name was Chrysippus, and he would turn this porch-born philosophy into an intellectual skyscraper. If Zeno was the founder who lit the first flame, and Cleanthes was the strongman who kept it burning through the storm, then Chrysippus was the master architect who built a fireproof temple around it. Without Chrysippus, Stoicism might have faded away as a collection of inspiring but vague aphorisms. Instead, thanks to his relentless work, it became one of the most comprehensive and logically rigorous philosophical systems of the ancient world. This was a man of almost superhuman intellect and productivity. He reportedly wrote over 700 books. Though nearly all are now lost to time, their influence shaped Stoicism for centuries. Chrysippus was a force of nature. He didn't just inherit the leadership of the school from Cleanthes, he completely rebuilt it from the ground up. Where Zeno was reserved and Cleanthes was poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His weapon of choice was logic. In an age where many philosophers relied on soaring rhetoric or emotional appeals, Chrysippus constructed a system of propositional logic so advanced that it wouldn't be rivaled until the 19th century. He was obsessed with consistency and clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was going to survive and defend itself against rival schools like the Epicureans and the Skeptics, it couldn't just feel right, it had to be logically airtight. No loopholes, no fuzzy thinking, no comforting platitudes. He refined and expanded every corner of the philosophy. He took the Stoic distinction between what is in our control, our judgments, and what is not, everything else, and explored its implications with painstaking detail. He fortified their ethics, metaphysics, and physics, turning them into a single, coherent whole. He was famous for his uncompromising stance on virtue. He argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. Not virtue plus health, or virtue plus a good reputation. Just virtue. Full stop. A poor, sick, tortured man who was virtuous was, in the Stoic sense, completely happy. This was a hard pill to swallow, but Chrysippus insisted on its logical necessity. One of his most fascinating contributions was to the theory of meaning, with his concept of the lecton. It's a bit abstract, but it's brilliant. He argued that when you say something, there are three components: the sound itself, the word tree, the physical object in the world, the actual tree, and a third, non-physical thing, the sayable, or the meaning itself. This lecton is the actual proposition: there is a tree, that can be true or false. This might sound like dry academic hair-splitting, but for the Stoics, it was vital. It was another tool to clarify the relationship between reality, our perception of it, and the rational judgments we form, the very bedrock of a good life. But Chrysippus wasn't just a dusty scholar. He had a biting wit and a sharp tongue. He famously died of laughter after seeing a donkey eating his figs. He told his slave to give the donkey a drink of unmixed wine to wash them down, and the absurdity of the image supposedly sent him into a fatal laughing fit. While likely apocryphal, the story captures his personality. On another occasion, when accused of not living up to the perfect ideals he preached, he supposedly retorted, "I am like a doctor who gets sick." He still knows the principles of medicine, even if he can't apply them perfectly to himself right now. Stoicism was never about achieving perfection. It was about the relentless, daily effort to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to the monumental work of Chrysippus, Stoicism was hardened, sharpened, and codified. It was no longer just a comfort for the shipwrecked or an inspiration for the perseverant. It was now a formidable intellectual discipline, ready to be exported from the porches of Greece to the corridors of power in the heart of the Roman Empire. By the time Stoicism made its way to Rome, the Republic was transforming into an empire, and the cultural landscape was changing with it. The Romans, at their core, were pragmatists. They were builders, soldiers, and administrators. While they respected Greek intellectual culture, they had little patience for abstract metaphysical debates that didn't have a clear, practical application. They were dealing with civil wars, political conspiracies, assassinations, and the immense pressure of governing a vast, multicultural empire. They didn't need a philosophy to debate, they needed a philosophy to live by. They needed a mental toolkit that could help them maintain their inner equilibrium while the world around them was constantly threatening to spin out of control. Stoicism, with its laser focus on self-mastery, duty, and maintaining virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect match. It evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a Roman art of living. Enter Seneca the Younger. Philosopher, playwright, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, and, most faithfully, the tutor and reluctant advisor to the young, unstable, and ultimately monstrous Emperor Nero. Seneca was not born into hardship like Cleanthes or Zeno. He was a member of the elite, hyper-educated, and dangerously close to the center of power. Yet his writings, particularly his famous letters to Lucilius, reveal a man profoundly aware of life's fragility and the corrupting influence of luxury and power. In his letters, Seneca acts as a sort of philosophical coach, offering practical advice on how to live a better life. He preaches restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warns against being enslaved by our emotions, especially anger and fear. He suggests practical exercises, like practicing poverty, deliberately living for a few days on meager food and simple lodging to rob financial ruin of its terror. And yet, Seneca's own life was a masterclass in contradiction. He wrote passionately about the evils of wealth while amassing one of Rome's great fortunes. He praised virtue and reason while serving a tyrant who embodied their opposites. He was a walking, talking paradox. But rather than discrediting him, this tension is precisely what makes him so compelling and so human. Seneca never posed as a perfected sage. He was painfully aware of his own compromises and failings. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "and I never will be. I am pointing out the path to others, like a signpost that cannot travel the road itself." And in that humility, that honest struggle, lies a deeply Stoic lesson. The goal is not to claim mastery, but to continue the pursuit, however imperfectly. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the Roman elite, another figure gave it to everyone else. His name was Epictetus. His life could not have been more different from Seneca's. Epictetus was a slave, born in what is now modern-day Turkey. He was owned by a wealthy and cruel freedman in Nero's court. His name literally means, acquired. He owned nothing, not even his own body. Legend has it that his master, in a fit of rage, once began twisting his leg. Epictetus, calmly looking at him, said, "If you continue, you will break it." His master continued, and the bone snapped. Epictetus simply remarked, "I told you it would break." Whether the story is true or not, it perfectly captures his philosophy. For Epictetus, true freedom had absolutely nothing to do with one's external circumstances. "You may chain my leg," he famously taught, "but not even Zeus himself can conquer my will." He argued that the universe presents us with a clear division, things we can control, and things we cannot. What can't we control? Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, what other people do. What can we control? Our judgments, our opinions, our desires, our will, our inner world. The secret to a happy life, he taught, was to invest all of our energy into the things we can control and to cultivate a serene acceptance of everything else. Life's hardships weren't obstacles to be lamented, they were training grounds for virtue, opportunities to practice courage, patience, and resilience. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just a philosophy. It was armor. And soon, that armor would be worn by the single most powerful man in the known world. It is one thing to study philosophy in a quiet library. It is another thing entirely to try and live it while commanding legions on a war-torn frontier, ruling an empire ravaged by plague, and grappling with betrayal in your own inner circle. Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born to a life of unimaginable power and privilege. Yet his reign was one of constant, grinding crisis. A devastating plague, brought back by soldiers from the east, wiped out millions across the empire. Germanic tribes relentlessly pushed against the northern borders, forcing him to spend years of his reign in a military tent on the cold banks of the Danube. His co-emperor and adopted brother, Lucius Verus, died young. One of his most trusted generals launched a rebellion, attempting to usurp the throne. And perhaps most painfully, his own son and heir, Commodus, would grow into the very type of vain, cruel tyrant he had spent his life trying not to be. Amidst this relentless turmoil, Marcus didn't write triumphal propaganda or self-aggrandizing memoirs. He wrote to himself. In the quiet hours of the early morning, by the light of a flickering lamp, he wrote a series of personal reflections, reminders, and self-rebukes. These notes were never intended for publication. They were later collected and published as the book we now call the Meditations. They are one of the most remarkable documents in history, offering a direct window into the mind of a Stoic under extreme pressure. They read not like the declarations of a king, but like the whispered mantras of a tired man desperately trying to hold himself to a higher standard. "Begin each day by telling yourself," he wrote, "today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." This wasn't pessimism, it was strategic preparation. By anticipating life's difficulties, he could face them without being shocked or thrown off balance. To Marcus, the misdeeds of others were not personal insults, they were the product of their ignorance of what is truly good and evil. His duty wasn't to rage at them, but to act with virtue himself, like a rock that stands firm as the waves crash against it. He constantly reminded himself of his own mortality. "You could leave life right now, he would write. Let that determine what you do and say and think. This wasn't a morbid obsession with death. It was an urgent call to clarity and purpose. With limited time, there was no room for pettiness, vanity, or procrastination. Despite commanding the world's most powerful army, Marcus was obsessed with his inner kingdom. He believed you could be surrounded by utter chaos and yet remain serene and untouched, so long as your mind, your inner citadel, remained anchored in reason and virtue. He did not invent Stoicism. But in many ways, he represented its culmination. He proved that this philosophy wasn't just for Greek lecturers or ascetic slaves. It was a practical guide for anyone, even the master of the world, who wanted to carry a sense of peace onto the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the bright flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It would not be extinguished, but it would retreat into the shadows, waiting for centuries to be rediscovered. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, the story of Stoicism takes a quiet turn. The philosophy that had been a guiding light for Roman statesmen didn't die overnight, but its prominence began to wane, like a tide slowly receding from the shore. Part of the reason was political. The throne passed to Marcus's son, Commodus, who seemed almost perversely determined to be the anti-Stoic. Where Marcus embodied restraint, duty, and humility, Commodus was a monument to self-indulgence, vanity, and cruelty. He famously entered the gladiatorial arena, not as a show of strength, but as a narcissistic spectacle. In a court obsessed with excess and entertainment, the sober, demanding philosophy of Stoicism had little appeal. At the same time, a new spiritual force was rising across the empire, Christianity. As this new faith spread, with its compelling narrative of salvation, its powerful community structures, and its promise of an afterlife, it began to occupy the space in people's hearts and minds that philosophies like Stoicism once held. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance through reason, Christianity preached reliance on divine grace. Where Stoicism advocated a calm acceptance of an impersonal fate governed by logos, Christianity spoke of a personal God with a plan for redemption. Though the worldviews were different, Christian thinkers did not simply dismiss Stoicism. Many of the early church fathers had a complex and often admiring relationship with it. They saw the Stoics as noble pagans who, through the power of reason alone, had come remarkably close to a Christian understanding of morality and self-discipline. Thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, while critical of what he saw as Stoic pride, respected their moral seriousness and their understanding of virtue. And so, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated. Its core ideas began to seep into the foundations of Christian thought, especially within monastic traditions. The rigorous self-examination, the practice of silence, the denial of luxury, the focus on living each day with purpose, all of these practices, central to the lives of Christian ascetics in the deserts of Egypt and Syria, would have felt deeply familiar to Epictetus or Seneca. Stoicism's DNA was being preserved, woven into the fabric of a new dominant worldview. Throughout the long medieval period, Stoicism became a kind of background hum in Western culture. It was respected by scholars, quoted by theologians, and kept alive in monastery libraries by scribes painstakingly copying ancient texts. But it was no longer a living, breathing movement practiced on the streets. It was a whisper in the margins of history. But survival, sometimes, is its own form of victory. This quiet endurance meant that when the intellectual climate of Europe began to shift centuries later during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the ideas of Zeno, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius were there, waiting to be rediscovered. The seeds had been planted deep in the soil of Western thought, and when people once again began searching for a source of purpose and strength grounded in reason rather than revelation, those seeds would finally begin to bloom. Stoicism's modern comeback didn't happen with a thunderclap. It was a slow dawn, beginning in academic circles and gradually spreading into the wider culture. For centuries, it had been treated as a historical curiosity, a dry subject for classical scholars. But in the 20th century, philosophers like the Frenchman Pierre Hadot began to argue for a radical new interpretation. Hadot insisted that we were misreading the ancients. Philosophy in their time, he argued, was not an abstract intellectual exercise, it was a way of life. The texts of Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus weren't meant to be just analyzed, they were meant to be used. They were spiritual exercises designed to transform the self. This message, that Stoicism was a practical art of living, not a cold or harsh intellectual system, began to resonate. In the early 2000s, this idea broke out of the academy and into the mainstream. Authors like Ryan Holiday took the dense writings of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and translated them into a clear, accessible toolkit for modern resilience. Books like The Obstacle is the Way framed Stoicism as the ultimate operating system for anyone facing a challenge, whether you were a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, a professional athlete, or simply someone trying to get through a difficult week. The philosophy found a surprisingly eager audience among tech leaders, military personnel, and sports coaches. Figures like Tim Ferriss and Naval Ravikant began to champion Stoic texts as manuals for high-performance living and mental clarity. In a world that moves at lightning speed, encourages shallow thinking, and feeds on constant external validation, Stoicism offered a powerful antidote: stillness, self-control, and an internal scorecard. Even the world of mental health began to openly acknowledge its debt. The principles behind one of the most effective modern therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, are almost a direct echo of Stoic teachings. The core idea of CBT, that our emotional suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our beliefs about those events, is pure Epictetus. The practice of challenging and reframing our negative thoughts is a modern version of the Stoic discipline of assent. Of course, this popular revival has not been without its critics. Some argue that this modern Stoicism has been stripped of its nuance and depth, reduced to a collection of life hacks and motivational quotes for productivity brothers. And there is a kernel of truth to that. Not every inspirational meme on Instagram captures the rigorous humility of the original practice. It's easy to quote Marcus Aurelius, it's infinitely harder to live like him. Still, the fact remains that Stoicism has survived for over 2 millennia not because it's trendy, but because it is profoundly useful. When life throws its inevitable storms at us, when we lose a job, face a frightening diagnosis, or wake up feeling lost and uncertain, Stoicism provides a durable framework. It reminds us that while we can't control what happens, we can always control who we choose to become in response. That message has never gone out of style. And so, we arrive back at the present moment. Here, in our world of buzzing phones and endless notifications, Stoicism exists as a beautiful paradox. It is an ancient philosophy designed for achieving inner peace, and it is thriving in an age obsessed with external noise. Scroll through your social media feed, and you might see a quote from Marcus Aurelius nestled between a political outrage and a video of a cat. Open a bestseller list, and you'll find a Stoic guide waiting to be your daily mental vitamin. Somehow, a 2,300-year-old philosophy born on a painted porch in Athens is trending. But its popularity isn't about fashion. It's about a deep and specific modern hunger, the need for mental clarity in an era of overwhelming confusion. When so much feels out of our control, the economy, the climate, the algorithms that shape our lives, Stoicism offers a map back to ourselves. It gently asks us to shift our focus away from the external chaos and onto the small, powerful kingdom we still rule, the kingdom of our own choices. The central questions posed by Zeno all those centuries ago remain as urgent as ever. What, in this life, is truly up to you? What kind of person will you choose to be, regardless of your circumstances? And unlike some philosophies that might demand a complete withdrawal from the world, Stoicism invites us to participate fully. Go to work, raise your family, engage with your community, but do it from a place of inner calm, not frantic craving. Act with purpose, but let that purpose be grounded in virtue, not in the desperate need for approval or success. In this sense, practicing Stoicism today is a kind of rebellion. Not a loud, banner-waving rebellion, but a quiet, internal resistance. It is a rebellion against impulsiveness, distraction, and emotional reactivity. It is the discipline to create a space between a stimulus and your response. It is the courage to remain kind and rational in a moment of conflict. It is the humility to understand that you are not the center of the universe, but that you are the sole master of your own character. More than ever, people are returning to this simple, powerful clarity. Athletes use it to manage the crushing pressure of competition. Veterans use it to process the trauma of war. Leaders use it to guide their organizations without succumbing to ego. And ordinary people, overwhelmed by the constant flood of information and comparison, are turning to the wisdom of a crippled slave and a weary emperor for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic wand. You will still feel grief. You will still fail. You will still, on occasion, lose your temper. But Stoicism doesn't promise a life without pain. It offers something far more valuable, a framework to endure that pain with dignity, to get back up after you fall, and to re-enter the fray a little bit wiser, a little bit stronger, and a little bit calmer than before. In the end, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that increasingly rewards and demands loudness, perhaps the most revolutionary and peaceful act of all, is to be still. Hello, and welcome same steamy air with a common soldier. Women and slaves had their own separate facilities or restricted hours, but they too were in. Settle in, get comfortable. Tonight, we're not just talking about history, we're going to step into it. We're traveling back to a time when an empire, at the peak of its power, believed that it's integral part of this daily, empire-wide ritual. For the Romans, bathing wasn't a moment of vanity. It was a cornerstone of civilization itself, a place where the individual dissolved, just for a moment, into the greater, collective very soul could be found not in the Senate, nor on the battlefield, but in the rising steam of a public bath. If you were to stumble upon the ruins of a Roman bath today, you might think you found an ancient luxury hum of the empire, one deep, steamy breath at a time. The Roman baths weren't just culturally significant, they were breathtaking feats of engineering, a testament to a mindset that saw no problem as too big to be spa resort. You'd see the ghosts of marble floors, the sweeping arches of vaulted ceilings, and the serene, empty pedestals where statues of gods once stood watch. You can almost feel the sun warming the stone, almost hear the echoes solved with bricks, water, and sheer ingenuity. Long before we had thermostats, electric water heaters, or radiant floor heating, the of splashing water. But for a citizen of ancient Rome, this wasn't a five-star getaway. It wasn't a Romans had mastered the creation of a perfect, controllable, and utterly immersive wellness environment. At the very core of this technological special occasion. This was Tuesday. Or Wednesday. Or any day, really. Bathing was as routine as breakfast, a marvel was the hypocaust system. Picture a building's basement, but instead of storage, it's a dedicated furnace room. Down in these dark, sweltering chambers, slaves known as fornicators toiled in fundamental, non-negotiable part of the daily rhythm of life. By the 1st century AD, at the zenith of its hellish conditions, endlessly stoking roaring furnaces, or prefurnia. These fires didn't heat the rooms directly. Instead, they heated the air in a large, hollow space beneath the main floor of the caldarium and tepidarium. The floor wasn't solid, it was a massive slab of concrete and tile resting on hundreds of short imperial glory. Rome was a city of water and steam. Over 900 public baths, or thermae, dotted the urban landscape. They ranged from the colossal, state-funded imperial complexes that could hold thousands, to the modest, friendly, sturdy pillars of brick called pili. Hot air and smoke from the furnace would billow into this sub-neighborhood balnea tucked away on a side street. And everybody went. The senator, crafting his next speech floor chamber, flowing between the pillars like a fiery river. This superheated air would warm the floor above to a pleasant in his head, would soak just a few feet away from the shoemaker, trying to wash the scent of leather from his skin. The soldier on leave, the poet seeking inspiration, the merchant finalizing a deal, the baths called to them all. Consistent temperature. But the genius didn't stop there. The walls were also hollow, containing a network of ceramic box flues called tubuli. The hot air would be drawn up through these flues, heating the walls from cleanliness was, of course, a factor. But to think of it as just a place to get clean is like calling a grand library a place to store paper. The real magic was in the ritual, the unhurried progression through the inside before finally escaping through a chimney. The result? A room that was heated from all directions, below, and temperatures and sensations. It was a carefully choreographed dance of heat, sweat, and renewal. Your journey would begin in from the sides, creating a gentle, radiant warmth without a trace of suffocating smoke. It was, in effect, a giant, the apoditerium, the changing room. This was the grand lobby, the portal between the chaotic, dusty walk-in oven designed for people instead of bread. The architecture was a masterclass in passive climate control. The grand world outside and the serene, ordered world within. Here, if you were wealthy, your personal slaves would be waiting. They would help you out of your toga, carefully folding it, and store your sandals in one of the carved-out niches lining. Vaulted ceilings weren't just for show, their curved shape trapped the rising heat and steam, concentrating it in the room the walls. For everyone else, it was a more humble affair, a bustling, chattering space where you left your street clothes, and your social armor, behind. From there, you wouldn't just jump into the heat. The domes, a Roman specialty, helped with both heat distribution and acoustics, amplifying the voices of chatting bathers. Romans understood the art of transition. You would first enter the tepidarium, a warm, pleasant room designed to gently raise the layout of the rooms themselves was a strategic thermal gradient, guiding the bather from the cool apoditerium, through the warm tepidarium, into the blazing caldarium, and back out again. Windows, often made of rudimentary glass or thinly sliced selenite, were strategically placed to capture the maximum amount of afternoon sun, adding a dose of solar your body temperature and open your pores. It was the system's gentle handshake, a welcome in. The air was humid but not oppressive, the heat radiating softly from the floors and walls. This was a place for lounging, for a climate power to the furnace's work. And none of this would have been possible without the silent heroes of the Roman world, the aqueducts. These monumental stone channels, marching across the landscape on elegant arches, were the empire's circulatorizing, for the first delicious wave of relaxation to wash over you. Then, when you were ready, you would system, delivering a constant, life-giving supply of fresh water into the heart of the cities. This allowed massive bath complexes to push through a heavy door into the heart of the experience, the caldarium. This was the hot room, a chamber operate on an industrial scale, even miles from a major river. The grandest baths, like those of Diocletian or Carr of intense, wet heat that felt like walking into a cloud. The air was thick with steam, shimmering in the shafts of light from high windows. The heat came from below, a powerful, radiant warmth generated by a brilliant underfloor heating system. Calidicala were mind-bogglingly thirsty. The baths of Caracalla, for instance, were supplied by a dedicated the hypocaust. Here, in the sweltering embrace of the caldarium, the real work began. You branch of the Aqua Marcia aqueduct and could hold up to 1,600 bathers at once, consuming millions would sweat profusely, the body's impurities supposedly pouring out of you. You would take a strigil, a curved metal of liters of water every single day. Yet the system was so brilliantly designed, relying entirely on a precise, gentle slope tool, usually made of bronze or iron, and scrape your skin, removing a mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt, that the flow was constant and the pressure reliable. This water wasn't just for soaking. It fed ornamental fountains, flushed primitive but effective latrines located nearby, and was used for steam rooms and saunas. Once used, the dirty water wasn't just dumped. It flowed into a sophisticated underground sewer system, like the famous Cloaca Maxima. It sounds harsh, but this was Roman exfoliation. Sometimes, you might pay for a massage, the masseur working scented in Rome, which carried the city's waste away to the river Tiber. The entire network, from the mountain spring oils into your tired muscles. Finally, after enduring the inferno, came the glorious release. You would move to the frigidarium, a room dominated by a large, deep pool of unheated, shockingly cold water. plunging into the sewer outfall, was powered by a single, inexhaustible force, gravity. These complexes were not set. That pool was a jolt to the system, a baptism of cold that slammed your pores shut, tightened your skin, and forget its structures. They required constant, labor-intensive maintenance. Teams of workers tended the furnaces. They sent a thrilling rush of energy through your entire body. This dramatic contrast, from searing heat to icy cold, from prof and night, others scraped algae from the pools, managed the vast stockpiles of wood needed for fuel, and repaired the intricate use sweating to a bone-deep chill, was the core of the ritual's power. Roman physicians swore by it. Plumbing and tile work. It was a massive undertaking. But the reward was a building that was more than a building. It was they believed this thermal shock therapy was vital for good circulation, healthy digestion, and a balanced mind. And honestly, looking a living, breathing system. In an age without a single watt of electricity, without industrial machinery, without a single line at modern hydrotherapy and sauna culture, you have to admit they were onto something. But beyond hygiene and health, the baths of computer code, the Romans engineered a seamless, predictable, and luxurious experience of heat, comfort, and flow. That were the glue of Roman society. They were the city's living room. You went to see and be seen. You went to gossip, to network, to debate the latest political maneuvering. Business deals were sealed in the steam. Mars. Why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a beautiful space. It was stepping into a perfectly calibrated. Triages were quietly arranged. Reputations were made and destroyed in the time it took to get a good sweat on. Some wealthy patrons brought their own musicians to play for them. Others brought snacks, sharing wine and olives with friends. Poets, machine, one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by pure, unadulterated genius. For all the sweat, steam, and strigils, the Roman baths were never just about cleaning the body. They were about gathering information. In a society without a 24-hour news cycle, without social media, without even the daily newspaper, the bath, hoping for a patron, would recite their latest verses, their voices echoing in the grand, domed ceilings. Philosophers' Woodhouse served as the central nervous system of the city, a noisy, unfiltered, open-air information exchange. G. hold impromptu debates, their arguments punctuated by the laughter and chatter of hundreds of fellow citizens. In a very real sense, theosophy didn't just trickle here, it flowed in a torrent. Imagine a space where senators, merchants, soldiers, and scholars all mingled, their togas and social armor left behind in the changing rooms. Voices carried easily across the warm, damp Roman bath was a democratic space, or at least as democratic as Roman society could get. Status and wealth certainly mattered, but for air of the tepidarium, amplified by the vaulted ceilings. Who just got a lucrative new governorship in Egypt? Which generals suffered a humiliating defeat on the German frontier? Who was the emperor's new favorite, and who had fallen from a few hours a day? The physical barriers were removed. An emperor might find himself sharing the water with a common laborer. Grace. Which magistrate was taking bribes to overlook building code violations? If you wanted the real story, the unfiltered truth behind, a site that was both a PR masterstroke and a genuine reflection of this shared culture. Of course, it wasn't a perfect utopia. Slaves and women usually had restricted access, separate wings, or designated hours. But they, too, were part the official proclamations read in the forum. The bathhouse was your primary source. This was no accident. The Roman elite understood of this vast, daily migration. For the Romans, bathing wasn't an act of vanity or a simple chore. It was a statement of identity. It was a routine, a social necessity, a form of medicine, and a public performance. The baths were a public stage, and they used it for both intelligence gathering and strategic performance. Politics didn't stop. It was a place where the individual dissolved, just for a little while, into the larger, pulsing, steaming hum of the empire. The steps of the Curia, it soaked right into the marble floors of the Caldarium. A savvy politician. The fact that Roman baths were so impressive isn't just about their scale, it's that wanting to float a new policy without officially proposing it, might, casually, discuss it with a colleague in the hot room, knowing full well that dozens of others were listening in. A patron might meet a client not in a stuffy office, but they were staggering masterpieces of engineering, built long before electricity, computers, or automated thermostats. The Romans didn't just build a while lounging in a warm pool, reaffirming loyalty, or dropping a veiled threat with a disarming smile. The environment itself was a tool of statecraft. The relaxation, the nudity, the shared experience, it all created an atmosphere of perceived intimacy that could be bath. They built an ecosystem, a perfectly balanced machine for creating comfort. At the heart of this mechanical marvel was the hypocaust system, a form of central heating so ingenious it wouldn't be rivaled for another 1,000 years. Imagine a space beneath the main floor of the hot rooms. This subfloor, the suspensura, was not expertly manipulated. Even the emperors understood this game and played it better than anyone. It's said that emperors like Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made it a point to regularly visit the public baths. This was a masterstroke of public relations. It's solid ground. Instead, the marble or mosaic floor you walked on was held up by a forest of short, sturdy brick pillars allowed them to appear accessible, down-to-earth, and genuinely invested in the well-being of the common citizen. Of called pili. Down in a service cellar, slaves, known as fornicators, stoked a course. They had their own lavish, private bath suites for their personal use. But showing up in the public section, massive furnace, the prefurnium, around the clock. This was a roaring inferno, a tamed volcano whose job was to produce a constant supply of superheated air. This hot air didn't just stay in the furnace room, perhaps even enduring a scrape down from a common attendant, was a powerful statement. I may be your emperor, but I am. It was channeled into the space beneath the raised floor, flowing between the pillars of the pili. The still one of you. I sweat, I bathe, I listen. It was a carefully curated performance of humility from the most powerful men in the world. But it wasn't just high-stakes politics that filled the steamy air. Business' entire floor above became a gigantic, slow-cooking radiator, warming the marble to a pleasant, uniform temperature. But Itman haggled over the price of Spanish olive oil or Egyptian grain. Ship owners negotiated cargo rates. Poets, like the famously, didn't stop there. The Romans then channeled this hot air up through hollow clay flues, called tubuli, embedded within grumpy Marshall, would recite their latest epigrams, hoping to catch the ear of a wealthy man who might become their patron. Philosophers would debate the nature of virtue versus pleasure, their arguments punctuated by the splashing of water. In a bizarre but brilliant fusion, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Wall Street, the Washington, D.C. political salon, and the walls. This meant the walls also radiated heat, creating a 360-degree envelope of warmth. The result was a consistent, enveloping heat without a single wisp of smoke or soot entering the bathing chambers. It was clean, efficient, and utterly brilliant. The architecture itself was a key part of the technology. The Romans were masters of the TMZ, all rolled into one steamy, chaotic package. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply performative. Everyone arch and the dome. Vaulted ceilings weren't just for show, their curved shape trapped rising steam and heat, preventing was both an actor and an audience member. But it was also where real strategies were born and fortunes were made or lost. Major decisions, military campaigns, financial ventures, personal allegiances, often had their genesis here, far from the formal halls of power. Because it from dissipating too quickly. Domes, aside from being beautiful, had incredible acoustic properties, but they also helped when everyone is half naked, relaxed, and sweating. The carefully constructed masks of public life have a tendency to diffuse the heat and light evenly. The layout of the rooms was a strategic thermal journey, carefully guiding the bather from the cool entrance to the warm tepidarium and then to the scorching caldarium, with each space acting as a buffer. And it was in the haze of the steam that the real empire often whispered its secrets and laid its plans. For the Romans, a trip to the baths wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking presentable. It was for the next. Windows were not placed randomly, they were positioned to capture the maximum amount of sunlight, especially the afternoon sun, to a fundamental pillar of health and medicine. The bathhouse was the place where ancient wellness philosophy met practical, daily self-care. Help heat the warmer rooms naturally, a primitive form of passive solar design. And none of this would have been possible without the doctors didn't just approve of it, they prescribed it. Philosophers endorsed it as essential for a balanced life. The silent, tireless heroes of the Roman Empire, the aqueducts. These weren't just stone bridges, they were the arteries of civilization, a vast circulatory system carrying the lifeblood of water across hundreds of miles. These elevated channels, engineered military-built baths at every major fort to keep its legions healthy and morale high. The core of Roman medical theory was the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four essential fluids in perfect equilibrium. Illness, whether physical or mental, was believed to be caused by an imbalance. Too much phlegm with a precise, almost imperceptible gradient, delivered staggering quantities of fresh water into the heart of the cities, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate on an industrial scale. The grandest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, causing a cough, or an excess of black bile leading to melancholy. A regular visit to the baths, with its signature cycle of heating, sweating, scraping, and cooling, was believed to be one of the most effective ways to restore that Rome, were unbelievably thirsty, consuming millions of liters of water every single day. Yet the system was so robust that the crucial balance. And even through a modern lens, their logic holds up surprisingly well. The intense, dry heat of the flow was constant, and so well designed that there were different grades of water. The purest water from the aqueduct might go to the drinking fountains, while lower grade or recycled water could be used for the flushing toilets that were often part of the complex. This water wasn't just for soaking. It fed decorative fountains, powered steam rooms, and, laconium, a type of superhot sauna, or the moist heat of the caldarium once used, was carried away through a complex network of underground sewers, like the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Again, all of this was powered by nothing more than gravity and genius. The baths weren't isolated wonders, they were the dazzling endpoint of a fully integrated urban infrastructure. Of course, keeping this machine running required constant human effort. The asterisk would induce heavy sweating, which we now know helps expel toxins and regulate body temperature. The heat also relaxed muscles and increased fornicators. Asterisk fed the furnaces with wood or charcoal. Armies of cleaners scrubbed the pools and mosaic floors. Plumbers blood flow, easing sore joints and promoting circulation. The plunge into the frigidarium's cold pool would cause blood vessels to constrict, reducing inflammation and giving the cardiovascular system a vigorous workout. Today, athletes call this contrast therapy. Maintained the lead pipes, and artisans repaired cracked tiles and crumbling frescoes. It was a labor-intensive, never-ending job, and pay a fortune for it. The Romans just called it bathing. The act of scraping the skin with a. But the reward was a seamless, almost magical experience of heat, comfort, and flow. A testament to an estrogen was more than just cleaning. It was a powerful form of exfoliation, removing the layer of oil, dirt, and dead cells that could clog pores and harbor bacteria. Afterward, a massage with scented olive oil would moisturize the skin and further relax the muscles. These oils were often infused with medicinal herbs, rosemary for alertness, lavender for calm, that achieved with fire, water, and stone what we now accomplish with a flick of a switch. For turning the massage into a form of aromatherapy. It was a holistic routine that engaged the entire body. We might call it a detox spa day, they just called it their afternoon routine. The larger bath complexes were true wellness centers. Many all the talk of sweat, steam, and strigils, Roman baths were never just about cleaning the body. They were about feeding the mind with the most valuable commodity in the ancient world, information. In a society that had no smartphones, included small clinics or consultation rooms where physicians, many of them highly educated Greeks, would examine patients. They might diagnose an number 24-hour news channels, and no printing press. The thermes served as the empire ailment, offer treatments, or prescribe a specific bathing regimen, perhaps suggesting a longer stay in the tepidarium for A's living, breathing, open-air broadcast center. This was Rome's social media feed, in real time and respiratory issue or avoiding the frigidarium for someone with a weak constitution. And health wasn't just a passive experience, full sensory detail. Gossip didn't just trickle through the baths, it flowed in a torrent. It had to be earned. Most bathhouses were attached to a palestra, a large, open-air courtyard dedicated to physical exercise. Before even starting the bathing process, Romans would work up a sweat. They engaged in activities that would look familiar to any modern gym-goer: weightlifting with stone or lead dumbbells, wrestling, boxing, gas off and inhibitions lowered. Conversations echoed across the vaulted chambers with startling clarity. Who was having an affair with a powerful senator's wife? What was the real reason behind the emperor's latest decree? Which general had just suffered with leather straps called cestus wrapped around their hands, fencing, and a variety of ball games, including a popular one called harpastum, a rough-and-tumble game that resembled a mix of rugby and dodgeball. A humiliating defeat on the Persian frontier. Who bribed which magistrate to secure a lucrative contract? If you wanted the real story, the unfiltered truth behind the official announcements carved in stone at the forum, you went to the baths. Your just goal was to prime the body for the heat, to enter the caldarium already sweating and with the blood pumping. Even had to open your ears. This wasn't an accidental byproduct, it was a core function of the space. The Roman elite mental and emotional health were considered. The slow, deliberate rhythm of the bathhouse, the unhurried transition from room to room, understood that the baths were a public arena, and they used this semi-naked stage for high-stakes political theater. From sensation to sensation, was seen as an antidote to the stresses of urban life. Stoic philosophers wrote about using the time in the baths for contemplation, for practicing emotional detachment, and for clearing the mind of worldly distractions. In many ways, the Roman powerful patrician, looking to float a controversial new policy, wouldn't convene a formal meeting. Instead, he might arrange baths were centuries ahead of their time, an integrated, public institution dedicated to physical fitness, hygiene, preventative medicine, and mental and accidental encounter with a key rival in the hazy steam of the caldarium. There, in a relaxed, informal setting, he could gauge reactions, build consensus, or drop a veiled threat, all under the guise of casual conversation. A patron would meet his clients not in an office, but while lounging in the tepidarium, reaffirming loyal well-being. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't an end in itself. It was the essential foundation for a life ties and dispensing advice with the easy authority that came with the setting. Even emperors mastered this game of public intimacy. Of virtue, clarity, and strength. And for millions across the empire, that foundation was laid every single day on the warm. The Emperor Hadrian, and later Antoninus Pius, made it a well-documented part of their public relations strategy to frequent marble floors of the bathhouse. To walk into a grand Roman bathhouse was not merely to enter a building. It was to submit to an overwhelming aesthetic experience. Every element, from the colossal scale of the architecture down to the smallest, the public baths. By bathing alongside commoners, they projected an image of accessibility and humility. It was a powerful message. Decorative detail was meticulously designed to inspire awe, soothe the senses, and broadcast a message of imperial power and sophistication. Though I rule the world, I am still one of you, a man who enjoys the simple pleasure of a hot journey began in the apoditerium, the changing room, which was an art gallery in its own right. The walls were not bare but adorned with vibrant frescoes. You might see dramatic scenes from Greek mythology, the labors of Hercules, the bath. Of course, they had lavish private bathing suites in their palaces. But showing up in the public zone, even for adventures of Odysseus, or peaceful pastoral landscapes with shepherds and nymphs. Sometimes, the art was more playful, featuring cheeky caricatures of a short while, was a calculated performance of solidarity. A very effective one. The exchange of information wasn't limited to politics. Businessmen used the relaxed atmosphere to negotiate shipping rates and commodity prices. Aspiring poets, like Martial or Juvenal, would try out new lines on a captive audience, hoping their wit would be overheard by a wealthy man and local politicians or famous athletes. Marble benches ran along the walls, cool to the touch, while personal belongings were stored in rows of carved niches. In the more luxurious establishments, a soft melody from a flute or lyre might drift through the air as need of a court poet. Philosophers from the Stoic and Epicurean schools would gather their followers, debating the nature of virtue and pleasure while others played dice nearby. The acoustics of the domed rooms were a feature, not a bug. They amplified voices, ensuring that a clever remark or a sharp argument could travel. In a strange and wonderful way, a slave took your sandals and handed you a fresh linen towel. Then you would move into the bath complex itself, a sequence of sensory delights. The tepidarium, or warm room, was often the most ornate. It was the grand central hall, a space designed to impress. It might be circular or cross-shaped, with a soaring, vaulted ceiling that seemed to touch the heavens. The floors were a kaleidoscope of colorful mosaics, intricate patterns of geometric shapes, or stunning depictions of marine life. The bathhouse was Rome's version of Wall Street, the Washington Beltway, and a celebrity gossip magazine all rolled into one, as if you were walking on the floor of the ocean itself. Light streamed in through large, high windows, diffusing. It was unfiltered, often loud, and deeply performative. But it was also where the real strategies of the empire were often born. Decisions that would shape military campaigns, financial markets, and personal fortunes frequently began not in the austere halls of power, but as whispers in the steam. Because when everyone is stripped down, sweating, and relaxed, the masks of formality fall softly through the warm, humid air. The columns supporting the roof were not simple brick or stone, but often carved from exotic away. And in that haze, the true empire, the one of ambition, intrigue, and information, revealed its secrets: imported materials, gleaming white Carrara marble, speckled Egyptian granite, or deep purple Phrygian stone, each one a testament to the empire's vast reach. The caldarium, the hot room, was a space of intense, shimmering beauty. The air was thick with steam, blurring the edges of the room and creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. You would find heated pools of various sizes, some for soaking, others for a quick dip. The taps, often cast in bronze in. To the pragmatic Roman mind, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking presentable. It was an essential component of health and medicine. The bathhouse was the place where ancient wellness philosophy met practical, daily self-care. The shape of a lion's head or a dolphin would pour forth a constant stream of heated water. Decorative fountains. Doctors didn't just approve of it, they prescribed it. Philosophers endorsed it as a path to a balanced life. Even the famously disciplined Roman military built bathhouses at every permanent fort, understanding that a clean, healthy soldier was engurgled peacefully, and statues of gods associated with health and beauty, Apollo, Venus, or the muscular hero Hercules, would gaze effective soldier. The medical theory of the day was based on the concept of the four humors, a legacy from the Greeks. Health was believed to be a state of perfect balance between four fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow down upon the bathers, lending an air of divine approval to the proceedings. Finally, the frigidarium offered bile, and black bile. If any of these humors became excessive or deficient, you would fall ill. A trip a stunning contrast. It was typically the largest space, cool, serene, and monumental. Its centerpiece was the cold plunge to the baths, with its carefully orchestrated cycle of heating, sweating, scraping, and cooling, was seen as one of the most effective pool, a vast basin of clear, still water that reflected the magnificent ceiling above. This ceiling might be a coffered dome with ways to restore this crucial equilibrium. And even through a modern scientific lens, their methods had merit. The intense heat of the caldarium would induce sweating, which they believed expelled excess humors but which we know helps eliminate toxins and regulate body temperature. The heat also served as a powerful muscle relaxant and vasodilator, increasing blood flow and easing sore joints, perfect a central oculus open to the sky, allowing a single, dramatic beam of sunlight to pierce the gloom and dance upon the water's surface. Other times, it was painted a deep blue and dotted with golden stars, creating the illusion that you were swimming in a celestial pool. There was a hushed reverence here, a stark contrast to the boisterous chatter of the hotter for an agrarian and military society built on physical labor. Then came the scraping with the strigil. This process rooms. Everything was calculated to create an impression of overwhelming grandeur and refined taste. This wasn't just vanity, it was propaganda in stone and water. The baths were the physical manifestation of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. They were, which might seem abrasive to us, was a highly effective way to achieve deep cleansing. After rubbing their bodies with olive oil, orderly, sophisticated, technologically advanced, and unapologetically extravagant. They were a daily reminder to every citizen that they were part Romans would use the strigil's curved blade to scrape off the oil along with any dirt, grime, and dead skin cells. It was a vigorous, mechanical exfoliation. Afterwards, many would enjoy a massage, where attendants would work scented of something immense, powerful, and enduring. Even the smaller, local baths took their aesthetic seriously. Their mosaic floors might feature humorous Latin inscriptions like, Utera Felix, use this happily, or even a playful, cave canem oils into the now clean skin. These weren't just any oils, they were often infused with herbs like lavender beware of the dog, at the entrance. These were spaces designed to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and remind relaxation, or rosemary for mental clarity, essentially practicing a form of aromatherapy. We might call this a detox spa day, they just called it Tuesday afternoon. The larger bath complexes were true wellness centers. Many included small medical clinics, often in case you had forgotten, that you were living in the greatest civilization on earth. And you got to experience all of that before you even got wet. While Roman baths were, in theory, public spaces open to all, the reality was a bit more complicated. The bathhouse was a perfect microcosm of Roman society itself, a place where social hierarchies were constantly staffed by highly respected Greek-educated physicians. Here, a citizen could get a consultation for an ailment. If you had a persistent being negotiated, where lines between classes could blur but never fully disappear. Let's start with class. In the monumental cough, aching joints, or digestive issues, your doctor's prescription might not be a potion, but a specific, tailored bathing routine. Spend extra time in the tepidarium, and make sure to take 3 cold plunges. Thermae of Rome, built by emperors to curry favor with the populace, it was indeed possible for an ordinary plebeian to bathe in the same vast hall as a senator. On the surface, this sounds wonderfully democratic. But the not just one. Exercise was inextricably linked to this vision of health. Most baths had an attached palestra. Distinctions were always there, subtle yet unshakable. The wealthy patrician would arrive with a small entourage of slaves, an open-air courtyard dedicated to physical activity. Before even starting the bathing process, Romans would work up a sweat. They engaged in activities like boxing, wrestling, fencing with wooden swords, or playing vigorous ball games. One popular game was **, a human support system carrying his expensive oils, his finest linen towels, and perhaps even a portable folding stool. He could afford a private, vigorous massage from the most sought-after attendant, or retire to an exclusive, club-like rumharpestum **, a rough, high-speed game that involved a small, hard ball and resembled a chaotic mix of rugby and known as a scoli, reserved for members of his social class to lounge and converse. Meanwhile, the common artisan dodgeball. The goal was to become physically exerted, to get the blood pumping and the body warm, making the subsequent visit might have to make do with a bring-your-own-oil policy and a quick scrape-down from an overworked attendant to the steam rooms even more effective. Health wasn't a passive state, it was something you actively pursued. One, wrestling. You might literally rub elbows with a senator in the crowded caldarium, but you knew your place. You wear and match in 1 cold plunge at a time. Even mental health was part of the equation. The slow, deliberate rhythm of about to strike up a casual conversation about his country villa. Then there was the great divide of gender. The bath, the unhurried transition from room to room, from sensation to sensation, was seen as a meditative practice. For the most part, men and women did not bathe together. The vast majority of bathhouses either had entirely separate, I.C. philosophers wrote about using the experience to practice emotional detachment and clear the mind of daily anxieties. In many ways, the Roman baths were centuries ahead of their time, an integrated, holistic space for physical exercise, deep cleansing, social connection, and mental parallel wings for men and women, or they designated different hours of the day for each. Typically, women would bathe in the morning or rejuvenation. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't an end in itself. It was the necessary foundation for a life early afternoon, while the prime late afternoon slots were reserved for men. Some socially conservative emperors, like Hadrian, strictly enforced this segregation. Others, like the notoriously decadent Caligula or Elagabalus, were rumored to have allowed or even encouraged mixed bathing, a practice that sent moralists like Seneca and Juvenal into a frenzy of outrage, decrying it as a sign of society's utter collapse. A woman's access and experience depended heavily on her location of virtue, clarity, and strength. And the path to that life began, every day, at the bathhouse. Walking into a grand Roman bath was never just about entering a functional building, it was about surrendering to a total, her status, and the prevailing social winds. In affluent cities, the women's sections could be just as beautifully aesthetic experience. The architecture, the materials, the art, the very quality of the light, everything was meticulously designed to impress appointed as the men's, though usually on a smaller scale. In poorer, provincial towns, the women's facilities the mind, soothe the spirit, and elevate the soul. It was a multi-sensory journey into the heart of Roman taste and power. Your immersion began the moment you stepped into the apoditerium. This wasn't some might be an afterthought. While respectable matrons certainly enjoyed the social and hygienic benefits of the baths, they were also subject to more sterile locker room. The walls were often adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting scenes from mythology, the daring labors of Hercules, the scrutiny and judgment than their male counterparts. The experience of slaves and freedmen represented another complex layer. They made up a huge portion of the bathhouse population. Slaves who performed hard physical labor were often encouraged by their masters to attend the baths for the adventures of Odysseus, or idyllic pastoral landscapes that transported you far from the bustling city. Some even featured cheeky caricatures of health reasons. However, they typically used the facilities during off-peak hours or went to more modest, less fashionable establishments. Local personalities. Marble benches, cool to the touch, lined the walls. Your clothes and sandals were stored in niches, and if you were in a particularly luxurious establishment, the soft notes of a flute or lyre might drift through the air as an attendant took your belongings. Then you moved into the bathing halls themselves. The tepidarium, the warm transition room, was often the most ornately decorated. It was a hall of civilized leisure, designed as a feast for the eyes. Great many slaves, of course, didn't visit the baths for leisure but for work. They were the ones the floors were a kaleidoscope of colorful mosaic tiles, forming intricate geometric patterns, scenes of marine life, or even portraits of famous athletes. Oaking the furnaces, cleaning the pools, and serving as attendants and masseurs. Some became well-known figures in their own right. The high, vaulted ceilings, sometimes coffered with recessed panels, were supported by majestic columns carved from imported Egyptian granite or gleaming local marble. Large, strategically placed windows bathed the room in a soft, diffused light, creating an atmosphere of profound tranquility. From praised for their skill, strength, or charm. And what about non-citizens and foreigners? During the empire's golden calm, you entered the shimmering heat of the caldarium. Here, the aesthetic was one of opulent utility. You'd see heated pools of varying sizes, some small enough for a solitary soak, others large enough for several people. Water-age, Roman cities were cosmopolitan melting pots, and the baths were generally welcoming. In fact, the deliberate construction of Roman flowed from taps often fashioned from gilded bronze, sometimes in the shape of a lion's head or a dolphin. You might see large bronze braziers, glowing with hot coals, to provide additional, localized heat. The air, thick-style baths in newly conquered territories was a key tool of cultural assimilation. It was a soft power tactic, a way of saying, "Welcome to the empire. We have superior plumbing. Now, let's all get clean together." You might still speak Gaulish or Greek at home, but when you stepped into the steam of the caldarium, you were participating in a quintessentially Roman ritual. So yes, the Roman bath was a shared, communal space. But just as with steam, would catch the light, making the whole room glitter. And even here, in this most functional of spaces in the Forum or the Colosseum, your experience was profoundly shaped by your wealth, your gender, and your legal status. Yet, for a brief, misty moment, surrounded by the heat, the stone, and the splash of water, art was present. Statues of gods associated with health and strength, like Apollo or Hercules, would stand in niches, their rigid lines could seem to soften. And for many, that was a small part of the magic. Though marble forms seeming to sweat along with the bathers. In the center of the room, you would often find bathing was the main event. Roman bathhouses were sprawling, multi-purpose complexes that offered a staggering variety of diversions. They were far more than just a place to get clean, they were entertainment hubs, a combination of a community center, a gym, a huge, shallow basin of cold water for splashing on one's face and chest, a moment of a library, a food court, and a social club. A Roman could easily and happily spend an entire afternoon there, and cool relief in the intense heat. Finally, the frigidarium. This cool, serene chamber was typically the largest many did. The larger bath complexes were the ancient world's all-inclusive leisure resorts. Your day might begin not in most architecturally dramatic space in the entire complex. Its centerpiece was the cold plunge pool, its water a sheet of liquid with water, but with a workout. Attached to most large baths was the palestra, an open-air courtyard where you crystal that reflected the magnificent ceiling above. Often, this ceiling was painted a deep blue and dotted with painted stars, or could engage in all sorts of physical activities before starting your bathing ritual. Here, men would wrestle, box, fence with wooden swords, or play vigorous ball games. The sounds of grunts, shouts, and the thud of bodies hitting the sand it might be dominated by a single, large oculus, an open circular window to the sky. On a clear day, a sharp, brilliant beam of sunlight would cut through the misty air and dance on the surface of the water. There was a sense of quiet grandeur here, a stark and refreshing contrast to the boisterous energy of the hot rooms. Every element would fill the air. It was a place for both serious training and social peacocking, a chance to display one's strength, a conscious choice, a testament to the empire's wealth and engineering prowess. The use of exotic, imported marble from Greece and physique before heading inside. After your workout and your bathing cycle, you might fancy some intellectual stimulation. No problem. Many of the grand imperial baths had their own libraries, often with separate sections for Greek and Latin texts. A Roman citizen could finish Egypt and Asia Minor, the vibrant tile work, the advanced geometry. This wasn't mere vanity. It was his cold plunge, wrap himself in a towel, and take a leisurely stroll over to a quiet, sunlit room to propaganda in stone. The baths were the Roman Empire distilled into a single building, orderly, powerful, refined, and unapologetically extravagant. Even the smaller, local baths took design seriously. Their mosaics might be simpler, but they often had a charming, personal touch, with Latin phrases welcoming bathers, like bene lava, bathe well, or humorous warnings, like the famous cave canon, beware of the dog. This was a civilization that believed beauty wasn't a luxury, but a public right. While Roman baths were, in principle, public spaces open to all, the relax with a scroll by Virgil or Cicero. The Roman ideal was a healthy mind in a healthy body, and the baths provided the opportunity for both under one roof. Music was an almost constant presence. It was not uncommon for patrons to be reality on the ground was far more nuanced. The bathhouse was a perfect microcosm of Roman society itself, a place where rigid social hierarchies could momentarily seem to blur, but never, ever fully disappeared. Your experience of the thermae depended serenaded by live musicians. Flutists, harpists, and even singers would perform in the grand halls or entirely on who you were. Let's begin with social class. In the truly colossal imperial thermae offnated gardens, their melodies echoing through the domed chambers. You might find yourself reclining on a marble bench near a fountain, listening to a gentle tune while an attendant gave you an oil rub-down. The most famous complaint about this comes from the philosopher Seneca, who lived in an apartment directly above a bathhouse. He wrote an entire letter detailing the cac Rome, like those built by the emperors Caracalla or Trajan. It was indeed possible for an emperor to biophony that tormented him daily, the grunts of the weightlifters, the slap of the masseur's hand, the shrill voice of the hair plucker, the shouts of the ball players, and the off-key singing of patrons who fancied themselves performers. It paints a vivid, if noisy, picture of the bathhouse as a hive of constant seen bathing in the same great halls as common plebeians. This sounds wonderfully democratic, but the invisible lines of status remained firmly in place. The wealthy arrived not alone, but with a whole entourage of slaves. These slaves would carry their master activity. All this activity worked up an appetite. Conveniently located in or near the apodyterium were small snacks, expensive towels, his personal set of strigils, perhaps made of silver, his perfumed oils, and bars and food stalls known as papyni. Here, you could purchase wine, bread, olives, cheese, sausages, even a portable folding stool. They could afford private massages, special treatments, and would often retire to exclusive club rooms, and dried fruits. For wealthier bathers, the experience could be far more lavish. They might have their personal slaves bring or scoli, reserved for patrons of a certain class. Even in the shared pools, an unspoken code of conduct, them elaborate dishes from their own kitchens, enjoying a full meal in a private lounge. The fantasy of a decadent emperor eating prevailed. You might be rubbing shoulders with a senator, but you were not about to start a casual conversation with him unless grapes in a steam room wasn't entirely a fantasy, though public gluttony was generally frowned upon. Where you were of a similar rank. To do so would be a major social faux pas, likely earning you a cold stare or a subtle shove from one of his bodyguards. Then, of course, there was the great divide of gender. There is leisure, there is often gambling. Dice games, betting on the outcomes of the wrestling matches in the palestra, and other games of chance were rampant. While technically illegal in many public spaces, these activities were largely tolerated within the freewheeling culture. For the most part, men and women did not bathe together. Most large bathhouses offered either entirely separate wings for men and women of the baths. After all, this was a place to unwind and let loose. The steamy, dimly lit, and, with the women's section often being smaller and less opulent, or they designated separate hours. Typically, women and socially charged atmosphere of the baths also made them a natural venue for more intimate encounters. In some of the darker corners or more private rooms, trysts and transactions of a sensual nature were commonplace. This morally ambiguous side of bath life was a favorite target. Children would bathe in the morning or early afternoon, while the prime afternoon hours were reserved for men returning from work in the forum. Some conservative emperors, like Hadrian, enforced this segregation strictly. Others, like the notoriously decadent Elagabalus, were said to have not only allowed but actively encouraged mixed bathing, a practice that scandalized moralists like Seneca and Juvenal, who complained bitterly of satirists and conservative critics, but it was an undeniable part of the experience. Roman society simply had a very different conception of public space, privacy, and sexuality than we do today. From high-minded philosophy to lowbrow gambling, from rigorous exercise to quiet relaxation, the Roman bathhouse truly had something for everyone. One of Rome's most enduring about the noise, chaos, and immorality it produced. A woman's access to this daily ritual depended heavily on her location, her social standing, and the prevailing local customs. Slaves and freedmen constituted a huge portion of the bath. Achievements wasn't just building an empire, it was branding it. They standardized the Roman experience, creating a sense of cultural going population. They were generally allowed and even encouraged to attend for reasons of public health, especially if their daily work was cohesion across thousands of miles of diverse territory. And few institutions were as effective a symbol of this standardization as the Roman bathymy or physically demanding. However, they typically used the facilities during less desirable off-hours or frequented the more modest. From the cold, misty highlands of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, the bathhouse became a ubiquitous, less fashionable neighborhood baths. That said, countless slaves worked within the bathhouses as furnace stokers, an unifying feature of Roman life. Wherever the legions conquered, engineers and architects were sure to follow. And their standard attendants, masseurs, and barbers. Some became well-known local figures, praised for their skill, strength, or charm. Toolkit always included three things: roads to move the army, forts to house it, and bathhouses to keep it clean. And what about outsiders? In the cosmopolitan heart of the empire, foreigners, non-citizens, and people from the provinces were healthy and culturally Roman. These provincial baths were not mere carbon copies of the ones in the capital, however. They were generally welcomed. In fact, the proliferation of Roman-style baths across conquered territories was one of the empire's most effective, brilliant examples of adaptation, following the essential Roman blueprint, *apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, tools of cultural assimilation. It was a powerful, unspoken message: you are part of our world now. Welcome to civilization. Now take off your clothes and join us. A newly minted Roman citizen from Gaul or Syria could participate in this quintessentially Roman ritual and, in doing so, feel a tangible connection to the broader imperial identity. So yes, the Roman frigidarium *, while cleverly incorporating local materials and responding to local climates. In colder regions like Britain and Germany, the heated baths were a shared, communal space. But just like a modern public park or city square, your experience was shaped by your wealth. Rooms and the hypocaust system were the main attraction, offering a welcome and civilized respite from the damp, chilly weather. Your gender, your job, and your social standing. Yet for that brief, steamy interlude, in the shared famous Roman baths in the city of Bath, England, are a perfect example. They were built around a natural hot spring. That warmth of the stone and the shock of the cold water, those rigid lines could soften. And that, for many, had been sacred to the local Celtic tribes. The Romans didn't destroy the sacred site, they co-opted it, encasing the spring in Roman stonework and building a magnificent bath complex around it, dedicated to the hybrid goddess Sulis Minerva. Was a vital part of the magic. Though the act of bathing was the main event, Roman bathhouses were far. It was a genius move, blending local tradition with Roman technology. Conversely, in the blistering heat of North Africa and the Levant, the design emphasis often shifted. While the hot rooms were still present, architects expanded the shaded porticos more than just places to get clean. They were bustling, multi-purpose entertainment hubs, a combination of a modern gym, a community center, a library, and a food court. You could easily spend an entire afternoon there, and countless Romans did just that. They were, in essence, ancient leisure centers. Your experience might begin not with water, but with a vigorous workout in the palestra. This large, open-air courtyard, often surrounded by a shaded portico, was where Romans came to exercise. You could see men wrestling, their bodies glistening with oil. Others would be boxing, their hands wrapped in leather straps. You might see groups playing ball games, or individuals practicing with weights that resembled ancient dumbbells. The idea was to engage gardens, and, most importantly, the cold pools of the frigidarium, offering a desperately needed escape from the oppressive and physical exertion first, to build up a healthy sweat and tire the muscles, making the subsequent relaxation in the hot rooms all the more fun. The stunningly preserved ruins of cities like Timgad in Algeria or Jerash in Jordan showcase massive bath complexes that served as the social and recreational heart of the community. These structures were propaganda cast in stone and mortar. Every polished marble slab, every pleasurable. After your workout and your bathing ritual, you might decide to stimulate your mind. In a move that seems intricate mosaic, every gushing fountain served as a powerful, daily reminder to the local populace of the benefits of Roman rule. The message was clear: this is what it means to be civilized. This comfort, this order, this luxury, this is Rome astonishingly civilized to us today, many of the larger bath complexes housed their own libraries. Yes, libraries. A Roman citizen could dry. And Rome takes care of its people. But the baths also played a more subtle role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse was often their first and most immersive introduction to Roman customs. You might continue to speak your native off, wrap himself in a fresh linen cloth, and stroll over to a quiet hall lined with shelves of scrolls. There, he could relax on a bench and read the poetry of Virgil, the history of Livy, or the philosophy of Cicero language at home and worship your local gods in private, but once you stripped off your traditional clothing and stepped into the shared steam of the, blending physical rejuvenation with intellectual enrichment. The Roman ideal of mens sana in corpore sano, a sound mind in a sound caldarium, you were participating in a ritual that transcended your local identity. It was a great social blender. A Gaul, a Syrian, and a Roman legionary could all find common ground in the simple, universal pleasure of a hot bath body, was not just a saying, it was built into the very architecture of their daily lives. Music was in. A city wasn't considered truly Romanized until it had a proper bathhouse, usually bundled with an almost constant feature of the atmosphere. It wasn't uncommon to hear live performances from flutists, harpists, or singers, their melodies echoing gracefully through the domed chambers. You might be serenaded while reclining by a fountain or while in forum, an amphitheater, and a temple. Bathing was synonymous with civilization. While local flavors always remained, Sai attendant worked oil into your shoulders. The grandest baths might even employ professional entertainers, acrobats, jugglers. Evenrian baths might incorporate more Eastern architectural motifs, while Egyptian complexes blended Roman designs with older Hellenistic traditions of lush courtyards. The core experience was universal. No matter where you were, from the edge of the Sahara to the banks of the Rhine, comedians, to wander the halls and keep the mood light and luxurious. And, of course, there was food, and the Roman bath became an institution that made a sprawling, diverse empire feel just a little more cohesive. It was a place drink. Small snack bars and food stalls, known as papini, were often located in or near the entrance halls where, even on the farthest frontier, you could close your eyes in the hot steam and, for a fleeting moment, feel like you. Here you could buy a cup of wine, some bread, olives, cheese, or dried fruits. For the wealthier patrons, the experience was more like a catered affair, with personal slaves bringing elaborate dishes from their nearby villas. The image of a decadent Roman lounging were at the very heart of Rome. Like all the glories of Rome, the golden age of the baths and the steam and eating grapes wasn't just a movie cliché, it was, for some, a reality. Where could not last forever. As the Western Roman Empire began to weaken and fracture in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did there is leisure, there is often gambling. Dice games, known as tesserae, and games played with animal the magnificent institutions that had defined it. What had been a daily ritual for millions slowly faded into disrepair, abandonment, and eventual knucklebones, called tali, were rampant. Men would gather in corners, placing bets on athletic matches' ruin. Several interconnected factors led to this decline. First and foremost was the empire's economic collapse. Crippled by relentless inflation, ruinous military spending, and chronic political instability, the state and its cities could no longer afford the immense cost in the palestra or simply trying their luck in a game of chance. While technically illegal in many public of maintaining these vast complexes, funding the endless supply of wood for the hypocost furnaces, paying the salaries of the 100 spaces, gambling was a widely tolerated vice within the bathhouse culture. After all, this was a place to let off steam in of workers, and, most critically, maintaining the aqueducts became an unsustainable luxury. This led directly to the second factor, every sense of the word. And finally, the baths had spaces for more intimate encounters. In the labyrinthine corridors of the breakdown of infrastructure. The aqueducts, the arteries of the baths, were marvels of engineering, but they required constant. The larger complexes, certain rooms could be rented for private gatherings. Depending on the time, the location, and the lax upkeep. As imperial authority waned, these vital channels fell into neglect. They were either deliberately cut by invading armies toity of the local authorities. These spaces could function as anything from a quiet lounge for friends to a discreet brothel. This sever a city's water supply or simply allowed to crumble from lack of repair. Without a constant flow of fresh water, was certainly the morally ambiguous side of bath culture, but Roman society had a far different conception of public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today. The steamy, dimly lit, and anonymous atmosphere of the baths simply provided a convenient backdrop, for the baths were nothing more than empty, echoing shells. The once bubbling caldariums went cold, and the grand all facets of human life to unfold. One of Rome's most lasting achievements wasn't just conquering and marble halls fell silent. Religion also played a decisive role. As Christianity rose to become the dominant faith of the empire, it was standardizing the experience of being Roman across thousands of miles of diverse territory. And no institution did more to achieve this than the Roman bath. From the misty, chilly highlands of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, the thermae became a universal symbol of Roman civilization and identity. Wherever the Roman legions marched and the engineers laid, public bathing came under intense moral scrutiny. For many influential church leaders, the baths were potent symbols of pagan decadence, worldly vanity, and moral laxity. The nudity, the mingling, the association with sensual pleasure, it was all seen as a corrupting influence, an affront to the new Christian ideals of modesty and asceticism. While some Christian emperors attempted to preserve the baths down their surveying tools, three things inevitably followed: roads, forts, and bathhouses. These provincial baths were not mere for their public health benefits, the prevailing religious tide was against them. Many were eventually shut down, their magnificent structures repurposed into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. Their marble was stripped away to adorn new cathedrals, their statues toppled or carbon copies of the ones in the capital. They were brilliantly adapted to local climates and resources while still adhering to the essential Roman blueprint, the non-negotiable sequence of apodyterium, tepidarium, caldarium, and frigid melted down. And yet, the legacy of the Roman bath was too powerful to disappear completely. It endured, transforming Garium star. In colder northern climates, like Britain or Germania, the heated rooms were the main attraction. The hip and adapting to new cultures. In the Islamic world, which inherited much of the Eastern Roman Empire's territory, the traditionalist systems were often larger and more powerful to combat the damp chill. At the famous baths in Aquae Sulis, modern was carried forward in the form of the hammam, or Turkish bath. These bathhouses preserved many of the core Romande bath. England, the Romans brilliantly co-opted the local sacred hot springs, dedicating them to a hybrid deity innovations, the sequence of heated rooms, the use of steam, and the emphasis on communal cleansing and socializing. The spirit, Sulis Minerva, thus merging local Celtic belief with Roman religion. In warmer regions, like North Africa or the Levant, of the thermae lived on, spreading across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. In Europe, the tradition, the design priorities shifted. The architects expanded the shaded colonnades and enlarged the cold pools of the frigidarium, offering went dormant for centuries before being revived. During the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, interest in classical antiquity led to a renewed appreciation, a desperately needed escape from the blistering sun. The magnificent ruins at cities like Timgad in Algeria or Leptis Magna for therapeutic bathing. Spas and mineral baths became fashionable destinations for the wealthy, particularly in places like Bath, England, and in Libya attest to bathhouses that were sprawling oases of cool marble and refreshing water. These structures were more than just public works projects, they were instruments of propaganda carved in stone. Every polished slab of imported marble, every intricate mosaic, every drop Baden-Baden, Germany, where the ancient Roman foundations were rediscovered and built upon. Today, the ruins of a flowing water from an aqueduct served as a constant, tangible reminder to the local population. This is the power, and Roman baths remain some of the most captivating ancient sites in the world. The colossal remains of the baths of Caracalla in Rome, generosity of Rome. We bring you not just order, but comfort. The baths played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly the beautifully preserved Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless other sites across the former empire stand as a testament to a conquered peoples, the bathhouse was often their first and most intimate introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your native Celtic civilization that didn't just conquer with the sword. It also conquered with comfort, engineering, and the power of a Germanic or Punic language at home, but the moment you stripped off your traditional clothing and stepped into the steam, you were shared daily ritual. The Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit is woven into the fabric of our modern lives. It lives on in our gyms and our spas, in our hot tubs and saunas, and even in the simple, private luxury of a hot shower at the end of a long day. In a way, every time we seek solace in the warmth of water participating in a Roman ritual. It was a shared experience that transcended language, ethnicity, and local allegiances. It also, every time we let the steam rise and feel our tensions fade, we are, consciously or not, channeling a small became the ultimate mark of a civilized city. A settlement wasn't considered truly Roman until it had a proper piece of that lost empire. We are partaking in a ritual of self-care, of time slowing, of the forum, an amphitheater, and, of course, a bathhouse. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was about civilization itself. Of course, fascinating local variations always remained. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated the elegant arches and tile world being held at bay, just as a Roman did 2,000 years ago.